Among the most disturbing footage of the October 7th massacre, which is also available to the general public, is the murder of a Thai worker by Palestinian civilians. It is a 47-second film sequence from the cell phone of one of the perpetrators. The soundtrack alone tells of incomprehensible barbarity. The voices come from various men grouped around the victim lying on his back on the ground, bleeding and losing consciousness. Excerpts. May history bear witness that this is the first person I have ever killed. Give me a knife. Give me a knife. I swear I'm the one who will kill him. I beg you, let me kill him. I swear I will cut off his head. I beg you, let me kill him. Allahu Akbar. Now one of the men hits the victim with a spade. Another shouts, give me, give me. Take a picture of it. He's a Jew. Take a picture of it, says the next man, before he begins to strike the victim's neck with 8 blows with the spade, accompanying each blow with cries of Allahu Akbar. Then he throws the spade at the victim. Let history be a witness. In fact, the sequence exemplifies a historically new dimension of anti-Semitic murder, moments in which the Islamist work of extermination differs from that of the National Socialists. The first moment is cheerful sadism. The phrase was coined by Lord Weidenfeld, the British journalist, publisher, and diplomat of Austrian Jewish origin, who died on January 20th, 2016 at the age of 96, had fled from the Nazis to England in the 1930s. In one of his last interviews for Die Welt am Sonntag, December 13, 2015, in the lowest circle of hell, he said, "The Nazis organized the extermination of their enemies, first and foremost the Jews, as an industrial measure. It was a disgusting, cold murder without much emotion. The Bolsheviks killed millions anonymously in organized famines, murderous resettlements, and executions. Horrific enough. But now these jihadists come along as cheerful sadists and also declare war on the free way of life. What are they doing? They behead and castrate their victims. They ravish women at will, crucify people, systematically mutilate them, and all with obscene sexual pleasure. For me, this is morally the lowest level of humanity." End of quote. What George Weidenfeld said about IS at the time also applies to October 7th. The obscene sexual pleasure, which of course did not play no role at all in the Holocaust, but was not central either, is an essential moment of jihadist horror. The perpetrator enjoys the physical proximity to the victim in the bloodbath and the literal slaughter. The second moment is the display of the deed. The murderers record themselves and their barbaric actions in photos or videos and disseminate them via social media. In doing so, they not only cause fear and terror, they not only torment the relatives of the victims, they also brag about their deeds and advertise their cause in order to recruit new followers and accomplices. Reporter Douglas Murray recently drew attention to this moment in a much-discussed interview. This is another way in which the Islamists differ from the historical Nazis, who tried to hide the genocide of the Jews from their own people and the world. Perhaps not so much because the Nazis, as Murray said, were ashamed of their deeds, whereas the Hamas terrorists and civilians involved act shamelessly. It is more likely that the Nazis knew, because of their Christian and/or bourgeois socialization, that they were crossing a line every conscience. This is what is meant when it is said that the Nazis sprang from civilization in both senses of the word. Since the Orient, on the other hand, was largely spared such Christian bourgeois civilization in the sense of Norbert Elias, the disinhibited barbarism of the jihadists can be described as a regression, if at all, a regression from a lower level of socialization. In any case, the Nazis replaced the traditional pogrom, at least in tendency, with a bureaucratization, industrialization, and delegation of extermination, which they camouflaged linguistically and locally, for which they only marginally employed sadists, to the exclusion of the population, who knew little about it and were expressly not supposed to participate in the murder. In the perverse self-image of the National Socialist elite, the extermination of the Jews was also a kind of burden that they took upon themselves for the good of humanity, something that they had to struggle through and overcome. Indeed, the heroic aspect consisted precisely in the steadfastness with which they endured the horror they had set in motion. This becomes clear in Himmler's Posen speeches, in the pride of having remained decent in what one had to do. For the jihadist, the ideology of overcoming oneself, great jihad, applies less to the murder of others, which one enjoys and does not endure, than to the desire for one's own death, either immediately in the suicide bombing or indirectly in the deliberately provoked Israeli reaction. The combination of archaism and modernity therefore works differently for the Islamists than for the Nazis. Hamas combines the classic pogrom involving civilians, escalated to the totally bestial, with state-of-the-art technology, cyber know-how to overcome border fences, smartphones, body cams, and social media for their monstrous version of propaganda of the deed. The similarities and differences between the Nazis and Hamas do not necessarily lead to the conclusion, as Lord Weidenfeld did in the Welt interview, that the jihadists are worse than the Nazis. Something else should be decisive for the friends of Israel. If the excuse of the therefore no less false historical appeasement with the Nazis, that one simply could not have imagined the extent of the horror, at least still testifies to something like naive faith in civilization, today's appeasement with Islamism seems to be an expression of civilization fatigue. What's more, since Hamas and its accomplices, as well as IS, publicly celebrate the anti-Semitic bloodlust, any appeasement, any obstruction of the Israeli military becomes an act of collaboration through complicity. When references are made to certain, shall we say, questionable deeds of the honorable Prophet Muhammad, such as the massacre of the last Jewish tribe in Medina, the objection is all too quickly raised that Muhammad's crime should simply be considered in the context of the times. Seyran Atesh, for example, remarked that you can't use today's law on the protection against violence to judge the behavior of Muslim men from the 7th century. The implication is clear. Everything used to be worse. Of course, that is not entirely wrong. What is completely wrong, however, is the suggestion that today's law on the protection against violence is the only context that can be applied. Rudy Parrott, like others, above all Norman Arthur Stillman, also referred to the standards of the time when assessing the Prophet's actions. Parrott proved his own standards when he justified the massacre. Because the Jews formed self-contained groups within the community of Medina, which could become dangerous for Muhammad and his partisans at any time, especially in the event of a threat from external opponents. End of quote. This is not to say that this could not be seen as Muhammad's motive, but Parrott's approval can be seen as an expression of his own convictions, which at least did not hinder his career in Nazi Germany. In 1940, Parrott took over the chair from Paul Kale, who not only responded to the request for proof of Aryan origin with the words, "Please don't keep sending me this nonsense. You have no right to ask me, a scientist and philologist, to sign such nonsense. I am not an Aryan. It is possible that the Indians and Persians are Aryans. I am neither Indian nor Persian. I am a German, and the devil knows what the Germans are." End quote. Although at the same time he had signed the appeal, German scientists behind Adolf Hitler. After his wife and son helped Jewish businessmen clean up their stores after the Reich pogrom night, Kale fell completely out of favor, was suspended, and finally emigrated to England. He was not reinstated in Germany after the war and was not awarded an honorary doctorate, as he had rendered outstanding services in England in the fight against Germany and had exposed his colleagues as the Nazis they were. Rudy Parrott, a member of the NSDAP since 1934, who not only interpreted for Rommel's troops in Africa, which he described as a kind of study trip, but had previously worked at the Institute for the Research and Elimination of Jewish Influence on German church life, in accordance with the name of that institute, was able to continue his career without any obstacles. It would be interesting to finally read a justification of the massacre and the expulsions that does not itself use anti-Semitic motives. In all cases, the mere presence of Jews in Medina or on the Arabian Peninsula is interpreted as a threat and danger. The fact that none of these justifications can do without such traits should perhaps finally indicate that the legitimization itself is anti-Semitic. The reformist Muslim Abdul Hakim Argi emphasized that the actions of the Prophet and his community can be understood from the historical situation of that time, just like the content of the Stuin. End of quote. However, the intention of this alleged critic of the Prophet is immediately revealed when he immediately follows up. The phenomenon of violence runs through the entire early history of Islam. Asking which side is to blame for the sometimes extremely cruel conflicts is rather an obstacle to an objective understanding of these events. End quote. Conversely, not judging is therefore the key to objective understanding, whatever the latter is supposed to consist of. In such cases, of course, the basic problem of the time context of the actions of prophets arises if their actions are to be timelessly exemplary. In principle, one should be able to demand more from a prophet than from a normal contemporary ruler, which is why Muhammad is often and erroneously described as a mixture of Jesus and Charlemagne, according to Maxime Rodinson, for example. Rodinson's preliminary remark on this characterization was not wrong at all. Muhammad was both the founder of an ideology and the founder of a state. What is completely wrong, however, is the fallacy derived by some from this that one can separate state and ideology, politics and religion, whereas Claude Cahun already insisted that Muhammad created a religion and a state in indissoluble connection. When Adorno and Horkheimer wrote about the militant religiosity of the modern age and immediately added the examples of Torquemada, Luther, Muhammad, we should never forget that Muhammad was the historical forerunner. Especially in the case of the Etonians and, in part, the Carolingians, it could be shown that the medieval rulers were not merely counterparts to Jesus, but that the relationship was somewhat more complicated. The relevant keywords would be, among others, divine grace, anointing, etc. With the Etonians, the depictions of rulers became more and more Jesus-like from Otto III onwards at the latest, which meant that the demands on the ruler to show clemency and the like, i.e. to be Jesus-like, also became increasingly drastic. At the same time, the words of Muhammad himself show how he separated the Jesus part from himself. About his comrade-in-arms Abu Dar, and the later critic of Umayyad enrichment, Muhammad remarked, Abu Dar is the counterpart of Jesus, the son of Mary, in my ummah with regard to his renunciation of the world, or whoever is pleased to look at the humility of Jesus, the son of Mary, should look at Abu Dar. End of quote. We should not exaggerate our belief in these passages, because this companion of Muhammad was certainly no Jesus in his lust for war and murder. But the only thing of interest here is that Muhammad did not see himself as particularly Jesus-like. In fact, Muhammad described himself as follows in Al-Jawazis, the circumstances of the chosen one, and differentiated himself from his prophetic predecessors. Quote, I received 5 things that no one received before my time. I was sent to mankind as a whole. I was granted the whole earth as ritually pure and as a place of prayer. I was granted the appropriation of the spoils of war, but not to any prophet before me. I was granted victory by spreading terror in such a way that the enemy is struck with terror when he is still a month's journey away from me. I received the keys to this world. End of quote. This means nothing other than that Muhammad's special role in Islam itself is reduced to the concepts of gain, terror, reference to this world, and claim to world domination. Furthermore, the problem of the context of time in general quickly arises, i.e. the question of what the context of time is. If one compares the Islamic killing of around 600 Jewish men with other ancient mass murders, such as in the Peloponnesian War or by the Romans under Caesar, or in the early medieval Saxon wars of Charlemagne, or in the blood court of Cannstatt, it does indeed seem laughable. The vacillating Rodinson comes closer. Quote, it is difficult to judge the massacre. One must bear in mind the customs of the time, which were very crude. However, the text's efforts to excuse Muhammad testify to the fact that it caused quite a stir. There are details in the written traditions that hardly allow one to believe in the prophet's innocence. End of quote. Nevertheless, he suggests that the time context is in a certain sense also locally limited. Local here means Arabia Deserta in general and Mecca, and above all Medina in particular. In contrast to Mecca, Medina was an oasis, rich in water and fertile due to its volcanic soil. Strictly speaking, it was not a city in the narrower sense, at least less of a city than Mecca. According to Julius Wellhausen, it was more of a complex of farmsteads, villages, and permanent houses, which were scattered between groups of palm trees, gardens, and seed fields, sometimes closer, sometimes further apart. More of a synoecism than a city. The very rough scheme says that there were 2 Gentile and 3 Jewish tribes. The origin of the Jewish tribes, Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza, is not entirely clear, but it is assumed or believed that they may have been refugees from the Jewish war against Rome. What is certain is that they settled in the oasis of Yathrib before the Arab tribes from Yemen, and that the Arab tribes were at least initially their clients. As in Chaibar, the Jews were pioneers in the field of agriculture. It is difficult to prove that the relationship between the Arabs and the Jews had completely changed, as is often claimed in the literature, and seems to be more of a projection from later times. The most that can be assumed is a certain degree of alignment, so that client relationships became relatively free and independent alliances. The Arabs protected the caravans of the Jews, but hardly practiced any trade or commerce. Montgomery, what refers to data according to which there were 13 Arab and 59 Jewish castles and fortresses in the city. The fact that the Jews became weaker and weaker, as the literature claims, could simply be expressed differently and more correctly. Militarily, the Gentiles ruled, economically the Jews, and politically simply no one. There were no offices, organs, constitutions, etc. In case of doubt, force decided. According to the myth, Muhammad was called upon to mediate in such a particularly drastic conflict. The conflict was particularly fatal for agricultural communities because, unlike Bedouins, they could not simply separate and get out of the way. Whether the Jews themselves fought is disputed. What is reasonably certain is that they supplied their Arab allies with weapons and shelter. In other words, it is likely that they fought a proxy conflict through their Arab allies. This also explains why the Jews themselves failed to realize that the conflict was against them as Jews and not as specific tribes in the context of classic tribal feuds, which is why they did not collectively defend themselves as Jews against Muhammad and his gang until it was too late. The best we can do is try to reconstruct the consciousness of the historical characters. This is always speculative, but not completely without sources. But this objection only serves as a defense every time, because hardly anyone simply looks at this time context. If one were to do so, one would come to conclusions that are not entirely flattering. Above all, to the conclusion that historical positivism, which is questionable in itself, does not even stand up to scrutiny. With regard to the massacre in particular, but also to other examples, it can be shown that it completely contradicted the Arab conventions in force up to that time. The clearest indication of such violations of the context of the time can be found in the Quran. If the Quran has to explicitly allow something after the fact, it can be safely assumed that the Prophet was under considerable pressure to legitimize it because it violated the spirit of the times. The list of examples of such breaches is long. In addition to the two prominent ones discussed in the text, only a few others should be mentioned here. The first successful attack on a caravan by the young Muslims took place during the pagan pilgrimage period, when all fighting was forbidden, and the attackers even disguised themselves as pilgrims. In the context of the time, this was such a serious sacrilege that the Prophet could not touch his share of the spoils without completely discrediting himself in his own community. Conveniently, verse 2:217 came soon afterwards. You are asked about the holy month, namely whether it is permissible to fight in it. Say, fighting in it is a grave offense. But to keep one's fellow men from the way of God and not to believe in him, and to keep believers from the sacred place of worship and to drive its inhabitants out of it, all this is more serious with God. And the attempt to seduce believers to apostasy from Islam is more serious than killing. And they, i.e. the disbelievers, will not stop fighting you until they turn you away from your religion if they can. And those of you who turn away from your religion and die without repenting, as disbelievers, their deeds are null and void in this world and in the hereafter. They will be inmates of the hellfire and dwell therein eternally. End of quote. The absolute taboo is transformed into a relative one, so that the Prophet could still take his share of the spoils. In this step, the Muslims were introduced as a permanently threatened entity that can justify any of its own misdeeds with this self-characterization. One crime associated with the violation of pagan peacetime, just mentioned, is the repeated Islamic murder of poets. In pagan Arabia, poets played a central role in the sublimation of violence, especially during the pilgrimage period. By praising their tribe and vilifying their opponents, conflicts during the mercantile religious gatherings in Mecca were temporarily channeled into a nonviolent form. At the same time, Conflicts only began with a particularly drastic poem, while others were resolved by turning a conflict into a poetry contest before neutral arbitrators. The significance of the mocking poems was enormous, and some tribes are said to have changed their name after their tribal name had been dishonored by mockery. It is probably an exaggeration to describe the pre-Islamic poets as sacrosanct. They fought themselves and were often the champions of their tribes or clans. However, they were regarded as journeymen gifted with supernatural powers, for whom people generally had a great deal of respect. It seems that the principle of equivalence prevailed, in which language had to be met with language. Some poets were sometimes blindfolded so that they did not spontaneously produce their mocking poems. However, there is not the slightest mention of poets being murdered or even systematically killed. In Surah 26, the poets, the Prophet followed up the Quranic reckoning with them, which had long since been carried out. Another multiple offense was the murder of the Jewish and Arab leaders of other oases by exploiting the right of hospitality. All attacks on the Jews were personally authorized or ordered by the Archangel Gabriel, which already provides a certain indication of the legitimacy of those attacks. In the Islamic way of thinking, the time context would be the Jahiliyyah, i.e. the pre-Islamic time of ignorance, or translated by Goldziher with cogent arguments as barbarism or savagery. In the Islamic imagination, this is the time of absolute immorality. It is the negative foil that is painted in great detail and provided with the greatest horrors in order to set Islam itself apart from it as an act of civilization. The Jahiliyyah became particularly important under the conservative Abbasids in order to distinguish themselves from the Umayyads. However, the concept is not simply alien to the Quran. In no way is the pre-Islamic period, which was in fact quite barbaric, to be set up here as a positive corrective, in both an empirical and an evaluative sense. For one thing, that period is difficult to reconstruct in parts, as it is largely buried under Islamic projections. On the other hand, nothing would be more wrong than to ennoble tribal barbarism as tribal humanism, W.M. And yet it can be noted, for example, that the alleged role of women in pre-Islamic Arabia does not even stand up to Islamic tradition. The alleged bad habit in the sense of a complete lack of rights for women in pre-Islamic times is an extremely popular apologetic topos. Peter Heine writes, quite symptomatically, in his introduction to Islam, in pre-Islamic times, women were probably not entitled to inheritance rights either. End of quote. That reads well, at least if you want to see it as a progressive act that women to this day only inherit half of the male share. However, the biography of the Prophet himself should raise some doubts about such a thesis. This objection is personalized by the first wife of Muhammad named Khadijah. She had inherited from her father, a Meccan merchant from the Banu Asad clan, not only his wealth, but also, according to tradition, the de facto leadership of the clan and its business. She was also educated, a widow twice over, and a successful trader herself, whose herd of camels is said to have consisted of 80,000 animals. In the usual exaggeration of the myth, it is also said that Khadijah's caravans alone were equal in size to all the other caravans from Mecca put together. She is described as extremely independent, and Ibn Ishaq also notes, she was a businesswoman of nobility and wealth and hired men to trade with her goods for a certain profit share. End quote. After she had turned down many proposals from wealthy to rich Meccans, she, who was 15 to 25 years older, proposed marriage to the young Muhammad around 595, so that he only had to make the formal proposal. The dowry, which she brought herself, is said to have consisted of slaves, female slaves, land, herds of camels and horses, goats and sheep, as well as the finest clothes, jewelry, gold, and silver coins. No relative had contributed anything, as would otherwise have been the case. According to certain traditions, she is said to have said to Muhammad after the wedding, "Now enter your house, my house is your house, and I am your slave." However, this subjugation of the wife to her husband is a clear distortion of Islam, especially in this case. In fact, Muhammad received pocket money from her. You only have to consider one story. It is reported that in the presence of his child's wife Aisha, Muhammad repeatedly spoke of Khadijah, who had already died, which is why the young Aisha jealously remarked that God had now given him a better and younger wife. But the Prophet is said to have replied, By God, she cannot be replaced by a better woman. She believed in me when others called me a liar, and she helped me with her wealth when others denied me any help." End quote. Here it becomes clear that her wealth remained in her possession, because Muhammad only got into trouble 15 years after the wedding due to his revelations. This means that she remained in possession of her wealth even after the marriage and subsequently became the main source of finance for the young Ummah. Islam was created by the sword of Ali and the wealth of Khadijah. End quote. This contradiction does not occur to Fabian Goldman either, who in an unspeakable article for the Gunda Werner Institute of the Heinrich Böll Foundation entitled "Muhammad was always more feminist than you" proclaims that Islam has brought women's rights in the sense of feminism, but a few lines later wants to underpin this with the success of Khadijah, without realizing that the construction of women's lack of rights and their inability to inherit in pre-Islamic times does not fit with this at all. Apologists also try to attribute the single marriage that Muhammad led with Khadijah until her death to the progressive image of women of the feminist Muhammad, without taking into account that his entire later life stands in stark contrast to this. Theses that emphasize deep love or other romantic references come closer to psychoanalytical interpretations of this relationship, even if they usually remain unconscious. In addition, or even more importantly, a certain urban emancipation of women seems to have been more likely, which Muhammad did not yet oppose. It is quite conceivable that certain basic features of the civilizing moment of value, this great equalizer, appeared in the trading Mecca and at least de facto overruled traditional norms. Formally, they may have continued to exist, as we saw in Muhammad's proposal. The rules of inheritance, etc., were also only revealed well after the death of Khadijah, who died around 619/620 while still in Mecca. The Surah 4 in question, An-Nisa, the women, on the other hand, is a Medinan surah and is usually dated between 625 and 627. It regulates all matters relating to marriage, family, inheritance, and the position of women in Islamic society. It can therefore at least be assumed that Khadijah was regarded by Muhammad as a representative of an old principle that died with her, but continued to have an effect for a short time. Rodinson also suggests that her marriage contract obliged him not to take a second wife. The wealthy Khadijah was in a position to make demands. End quote. Hartmut Babson, among others, failed to recognize the connection between Quranic surahs and violations of the contemporary context when he wrote that Muhammad's slaughter of the Jews was certainly consequent and within the framework of the ethical norms customary in Arabia at the time. If his actions had been reprehensible, i.e. against the prevailing norm, his biographers, who were interested in a fundamentally positive portrayal, would have concealed much more. End quote. The Prophet's misdeeds could not be concealed during his lifetime. They were known. The Quran, as a daily political marching order, had to react to this and provide legitimization. The misdeeds became asbab and nuzul, or occasions for revelation. The traces are sedimented in the Quran, which the biographers had to further justify, as they could not conceal them. With regard to the massacre, Argy referred to the great importance of blood revenge in late antique Arabia. Quote, "Violence in Islam is not a modern phenomenon. We must not forget that the practice of blood revenge, which was common among the Arab tribes at the time, played a role that should not be underestimated." End of quote. References to the well-established practice of robbery as a major source of income for the Bedouins are by no means incorrect. However, he blithely left out the difference between this and mass murder so that he could continue. Quote, "Customs and traditions originating from pre-Islamic times were therefore still practiced by the Muslims." End of quote. However, this statement simply does not stand up to a consideration of pre-Islamic blood revenge. The conflicts of the time were not continuous, but rather periodic. It was also the exception that they degenerated into real wars. The rule was rather murders or duels that took place according to rules, even collective ones. Springer emphasizes their proximity to student duels in terms of their theatrical character, ignoring the fact that the outcome was indeed fatal. The most important rule was the inviolability of houses, which were sacred, i.e. no one was allowed to be pursued into their own house. In the absolute majority of cases, It was ultimately about land disputes, which were resolved by the losing party ceding a certain area of their property to the victor. The raids were similarly settled, about which Rodinson aptly wrote, "The property was seized, if possible without killing anyone in the process, as the principle of blood revenge could quickly unleash a vendetta that was disproportionate to the hoped-for spoils." In this sense, it could be said that it was precisely the pre-Islamic practice of blood revenge that stood in opposition to the principle of extermination. It should also be remembered that a battle with around 70 dead, as in Uhud, was already considered a bitter defeat or a huge loss. Nolde captured the spirit of the times and its tipping point quite well when he wrote about that battle that, at least among the infidels, the Arab reluctance to give the enemy too much cause for blood revenge or to demand high blood money by killing too many people. Mayer Kister has subjected the massacre and its reception to a fundamental examination. He shows that the breach of a diffuse to corrupt contract was by no means a sufficient motive for a massacre and interprets the massacre as a pure enrichment strategy. A short time later, Michael Lecker worked out that before Islam, the complete annihilation of the enemy was never the aim of a war among the Arabs, nor was it even acceptable. How precarious the justification of this massacre was in the context of the time is also shown by the fact that the Arab Banu Aus, who were allied with the Jewish tribe through patronage systems, were forced by Muhammad to participate in the massacre of their former allies. Only by making everyone guilty could the Prophet satisfy his paranoia and eliminate the danger of blood revenge. The transition from razzia raid to footed conquest and jihad, as well as from mutual blood revenge to expulsion and extermination, are components of the channeling of tribal barbarism into Ummah barbarism, in the course of which the crimes of the Prophet were not only justified in their theological anchoring, but also became justifications for further crimes, which Claude Cahn captured quite well, or at least better, in the transition. The warlike incidents, on the one hand, continued the old habit of tribal battles and raids, but at the same time initiated the jihad, the holy war of the coming age. End quote. Cahn is more precise in a later formulation when he writes about the late 8th century, that in the internal tribal struggles an old tendency of the Bedouin Arabs to anarchy revived, a tendency that had been temporarily neutralized by the enthusiasm for the holy war. End quote. Cahn also pointed out with some justification, in an apparent contradiction, Muslims have never ceased to regard the period of ignorance as the golden age of Arab history. However, the contradiction is not quite so great. Throughout Islamic history, there is an attempt to reconcile both moments, which probably found its most important formulation in the work of Ibn Khaldun. The most striking feature here is the complete absence of criticism. In the case of Muhammad, it can only ever be inferred/reconstructed negatively, while the atrocities of the Athenian massacre on Melos, for example, were already subjected to a detailed and fundamental examination by the contemporary Thucydides in his historical work, The Peloponnesian War. And here, above all, in the famous Melian dialogue, in which it is pointed out that the applicable morals were considerably undercut in this war. Caesar was also accused of war crimes, albeit for instrumental reasons, and Charlemagne's Saxon wars were not always well received by the clergy. On the contrary, his own advisor Abbot Alcuin sharply criticized him, and during the Bavarian Synod in 796, the emperor was once again told off in this regard and reminded that missionary work with the sword was contrary to Christian doctrine. In this sense, it should be clear that today's Islamic scholars should not write an open letter to IS caliphs, but to their own prophet. In the letter to IS, however, the scholars write, "Killing prisoners of war is forbidden under Islamic law. Yet you have killed many prisoners, including the 1,700 prisoners of Camp Speicher and Tikrit in June 2014, the 200 prisoners of the Sher gas field in July 2014, the 700 prisoners of the Shaitat tribe in Deir el-Zur, 600 of them were unarmed civilians, the 250 prisoners in the Abqa military airfield in Al-Raqqa in August 2014, Kurdish and Lebanese soldiers, and many unmentioned ones that only God knows. These are heinous war crimes. If you claim that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, killed some prisoners in some battles, then the answer to that is that he only ordered the execution of 2 prisoners after the Battle of Badr, Uqba b. Abi Muay and Narbi al-Ri. These two were two war leaders and war criminals, and the execution of war criminals is permitted if the ruler orders it. This is what Saladin did after his conquest of Jerusalem and what the Allies did during the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. In the more than 10,000 prisoners taken during the reign of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. In a span of 10 years and 29 battles, he did not execute a single regular soldier. End quote. Significantly, there is not the slightest mention here of the massacre of the Jews. In addition to this massacre of the Jews, there is a somewhat less drastic but very important example. What is meant here is the falling of the palms during the siege of another Jewish tribe. After the first Jewish tribe of Medina had been driven out, the Prophet quickly turned his attention to the next, the Banu Nadir. The reason for this attack was an alleged plot by these Jews to assassinate Muhammad. When the Jews retreated to their fortresses, the Prophet ordered their palms to be cut down and burned. Shocked by this action, the Jews surrendered. This incident is also described in the Prophet's biography. Quote, "The Jews had entrenched themselves before him in their castles. When the Prophet, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, ordered them to cut down their palms and set fire to them, they called out to him, 'O Muhammad, you have so far forbidden wanton destruction and rebuked those who carry it out. How is it then that you cut down our palms and burn them?'" End quote. That they hit a sore spot with this reference is proven by the verse soon to be revealed. If you cut down palm trees or left them standing, it was with God's permission. He also wanted, in this way, to put the wrongdoers to shame, Quran 59:5. This is a further reference to the context of the time. Not only the houses, but also the palm groves were sacrosanct, and it is not without reason that the Jewish laws of war forbid taking action against plantations. Quote, "If you have to lie in front of a city for a long time, against which you are fighting to conquer it, you shall not lay an axe to its trees and cut them down, for you can eat from them. Therefore you shall not cut them down. The trees of the field are not men, that thou shouldest besiege them. But the trees that you know cannot be eaten, you may destroy them and cut them down and build a bulwark out of them against the city that makes war with you until it falls." Deuteronomy 20:19f. This also directly expresses the justification against which Muhammad and his band turned self-preservation or even pure selfishness, which is often the only motive that can still be appealed to. In order to fathom the sacrilege, one must consider the importance of date palms for Arabia and Medina in particular. Quote, "In the oasis, a sparsely populated sedentary population cultivates the date palm, the tree of all trees, of which not only the fruit but all the components are used completely, as the aunt and mother of the Arabs, as they say, provides the only solid food, supplemented by camel's milk, for the mass of Bedouins oppressed by misery." End of quote. A date palm can be used for around 80 to 100 years. They take a correspondingly long time to grow, but then produce an annual yield of around 100 kilograms per plant. The detailed Arabic Wikipedia article on the date palm demonstrates the almost libidinous attachment to this plant. The date palm is the race animal of the burning desert, field, garden, pantry, wine cellar, and general living condition of Arabia, Egypt, and most Asian and African desert peoples, wrote Ferdinand Stali in the Gartenlaub in 1857. And the outstanding importance of the date palm is documented in countless verses in the Quran itself. Medina, called Yathrib before Islam, bore the honorary name Anal, meaning palm-rich, among other things. Just how valuable wood was in the desert, for example, can be seen in one of the actions of the Jews when they were expelled. They demolished their houses, according to the Quran. This means that they removed the beams and door frames and took them with them into exile, as they were among their most valuable possessions. The date palm was to a certain extent the plant equivalent of the camel. In the primarily Jewish oasis of Chaibar and the pagan Arab city of Taif, this sacrilege is repeated with palm trees and or vines. Rodinson calls this cutting down and torching of palm trees the act of total war, while he justified the later massacre in spite of his above vacillation. It was obvious that it was necessary to get rid of this dangerous group. End quote. As long as and whenever the chant Chaibar, Yahud Skaish Muhammad Su /Chaibar, O you Jews, Muhammad's army will be back soon. Demonstrations against Israel are a reminder of that very act of subjugation. Politically, at least, the massacre was a very clever measure, or undeniably the best. The palm tree reference also receives a similar assessment from Parrott. Both hit on a very important point, even if they are hardly aware of it. What is meant is the relationship between self-preservation and annihilation. While the Christian martyr renounces the preservation of his self by renouncing the destruction of his opponent or even just the defense against his persecutor, the relationship for Islam is already shown to be twofold in the two examples. The expulsion and murder of the Jews can still be understood as a prey endeavor. The massacre, at least, does not contradict the principle of self-preservation, while the destruction of the palm groves corresponds to the logic of the suicide bomber. Although this logic was, of course, also known in a purer form in the semi-canonical biography and in hadiths. By him in whose hand is Muhammad's soul, anyone who fights the enemy today steadfastly and hoping for God's reward, strives only forward and does not retreat, and then finds death, God will let him enter paradise. Umar ibn Humam, who was holding some dates in his hand and eating them, heard these words and exclaimed, "Glorious! Glorious! Is death the only thing separating me from paradise from their hands?" And immediately he threw away the dates, took up his sword, and fought until he fell. The destruction of those palms by the now Medinan Muslims was not only a direct attack on the livelihood of their imagined enemy neighbors, but also affected their future own livelihood within the framework of the bag logic. The schematic separation made here is, of course, not so easy to implement, as both sides are blithely interdependent. The massacre of the Jews already exhibits the same logic of extermination in the renunciation of the ransom that could be obtained for the Jews in question. The war of extermination could become a very lucrative source of income as a threat backed up by examples, as the history of early Islam then immediately did. From Chaibar alone, Muhammad personally had annual revenues of 20,000 to 30,000 wask of dates and wheat. A wask is a unit of volume, or simply a camel load, and one such wask feeds a man for 3 months. A prophetic wask of wheat is 194.3 kilograms, whereas the post-prophetic wask is 485 kilograms. If we take the smaller measure, the Prophet's annual income from the raid on Chaibar alone amounts to between 3,900 tons and 5,850 tons of wheat and dates. It was income of this kind, an amount that made the Arabs realize the practical value of this new religion. One can also cite numerous facts against apologists who try to deny the loot mania. Just take Abdulaziz Duri as a popular, uncritically quoted example, who writes about Islam. He called for war for the sake of faith and rejected all mere raids. End quote. Since he, of course, knows that all holy texts consist to a huge extent of regulations on the division of spoils, he tries to deflect this. So he knows that the material side of the Islamic conquest was also an attraction and that some of the Muslims were motivated by it. But the leaders and the majority of those who fought saw the conquest as a basis for building the new Volksgemeinschaft and as a necessary duty to the general public. End of quote. The leaders and the masses in particular were booty-oriented, especially for the time of the first caliphs. Ephraim Karsh has shown the enormous importance of booty for the majority of the army and above all for the leaders. When the third Caliph Uthman was assassinated in 656, just 24 years after Muhammad's death, he had amassed a fortune of 150,000 dinars and 1,000,000 dirhams in cash, equivalent to 660 kilograms of gold and 4.3 tons of silver in today's terms. And the value of his lands was 200,000 dinars, plus a huge herd of camels and horses. End quote. But Karsh continues, quote, "This fortune, however, pales in comparison to the fabulous wealth amassed by some of Muhammad's closest companions. Zubair ibn Awam had a capital of around 50 million dirhams, 215 tons of silver, and 400,000 dinars, 1,760 kilograms of gold, and owned countless properties in Medina, Iraq, and Egypt. Talha ibn Ubaidallah, one of the first converts to Islam to whom Muhammad had promised a place in paradise, owned a similar amount of land in Iraq and Transjordan. He allegedly left behind 200,000 dinars and 2.2 million dirhams in cash. and the value of his property was estimated at 30 million dirhams. His investments in Iraq alone earned him 1,000 dinars a day. End quote. That's 4.4 kilos of gold a day. Another companion of Muhammad, named Amr ibn al-As, who conquered Egypt and administered it as governor, had 4,000 villas with 4,000 baths, 40,000 Jews paying poll tax, and 400 places for the entertainment of the royal family. To make a small comparison, in 425 BC, the Attic League collected 38 tons of silver, the highest taxes it had ever collected. The average was closer to 15.6 tons. Athens itself collected up to 52 tons of silver through taxes. Marcus Licinius Crassus, by far the richest Roman in the late Republic, i.e. around 50 BC, had a fortune of 235 tons of silver at the end of his career. The ransom demanded for Richard II, Lionheart, roughly 500 years after Muhammad's death, was 23.3 tons of silver, equivalent to twice the annual income of the English crown. The state budget of the entire Byzantine Empire under Constantine V had 775, 15.8 tons of gold, under Theophilos and Theodora, 859, roughly twice as much. However, in criticizing the allegedly overly idealistic Arabs' focus on booty, one should not forget what the flip side would have been, and of course partly was, which Dury pointed out in his apologetic above. They were simply fanatics for whom the material incentive was not the top priority. They were the ones who intended to implement the logic of destruction of their prophet, which was limited to a certain extent by the desire for booty of his person and, above all, his environment. It should be remembered that Muhammad could only be prevented from massacring the first two Jewish tribes by the energetic intervention of his former Arab allies. It was this intervention, among others, that earned the Abd ibn Ubay in question a place in Islamic tradition as the leader of the Munafiqun hypocrites. He risked his life and was abused by Muhammad's bodyguards. It was also only the interventions of his companions, the later caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar, who pointed out that it was future booty, that persuaded Muhammad to restrict the felling of palm trees in Chaibar after all. Thus it can be said that the mania for booty both conditioned the conquests and limited the destruction. It is precisely this that points to the Janus-faced nature of Islam, a religion that oscillates between two disgusting things, whereby the Prophet in particular united both sides in himself, and in quite a few cases clearly swung in the direction of the logic of annihilation, which was only curbed by his companions with an affinity for booty. Only in Dimitude are these sides of Islam, which rarely appear in pure form, halfway, reconciled, or mediated. The overly energetic and critical reference to the material motivation of Muslims is reminiscent of those characters who find it problematic above all that fascists are corrupt and seem less bothered by the fact that they are fascists. It is the typical German fascist resentment against the golden pheasants and party bigwigs in the NSDAP, which itself is naturally eyeing claims to winner aid. The Muslim willingness to completely renounce their own self-preservation, if it benefited the annihilation and expulsion of their opponents, was the barbaric novelty that was largely responsible for the success of Islam. In the early post-Mohammedan period, even the caliphs tried to recapture the practice of war of extermination by issuing decrees forbidding the destruction of plantations, if only for the sake of profit. They simply saw their prey under threat. However, Marco Scholler has demonstrated in great detail and pedantically that this practice of protecting the prey of the caliphs did not translate into law in any school of law, and that there was general agreement that palms or trees of infidels may be destroyed, cut down, or burned in the event of war. End of quote. Unsurprisingly, IS clearly referred to verse 56:5, jihad and its rulings number 15. It is allowed on necessity, need, or interest to burn the fortresses of the enemies by fire, destroy their homes, bring them down upon them, and cut their trees, and ruin their agriculture, when in that there is breaking their power, weakening their determination, and dispersing their gathering. End of quote. The open letter to al-Baghdadi is written against this fatwa and the war of annihilation waged by IS. Similarly, when Abu Bakr al-Ik, may Allah be pleased with him, sent an army to the Levant, he said to them, "Do not destroy buildings, cut down trees, or destroy storehouses without good reason. Do not slash or burn palm trees, and do not be treacherous. Do not mutilate anyone." End of quote. Scholer had already demonstrated in the 1990s that although this very decree of Abu Bakr was certainly discussed in Islamic people's jurisprudence, it was never able to override the decrees of the Quran. Only in a perfidious sense are the scholars right with their reference. The only reflection of the caliph's decree is that some Islamic legal scholars assumed a ban on palm felling exclusively for Syria because, as the authors of the open letter themselves write, Abu Bakr's decree only applied to Syria. It is more or less an argument against IS in Syria, but not the least bit valid for the rest of the world. If you simply take the reference to the time context seriously, it condemns the Prophet at least twice over. On the one hand, Muhammad was also and especially a criminal in this context, and the evidence can be found in the Quran, the defense document of that criminal. Secondly, there is a difference that left-wing critics of Christians and friends of Islam, i.e. general critics of religion, tend to forget. This consists in the fact that Christian rulers, such as Charlemagne, carried out barbaric acts and legitimized them with religious reference. But the criticism generally came from the clergy, whereas in Islam, it was precisely the clergy who stood and stand for the barbaric moments. This separation cannot be made absolute in either case, but it does reflect tendencies that reflect the essential content of both religions. Anyone who criticizes Islam in a fundamental way and justifies this publicly can sooner or later read the following sentence under their own article. This could also be in the Sturmer. Just as Michel Houellebecq described Islam as the stupidest religion. 15 years ago, he was not only accused of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, but also of incitement to racial hatred and religious violence, which was fortunately dismissed. The plaintiffs included numerous Islamic associations, as well as the French League for Human Rights, an organization founded during the Dreyfus Affair. Such comment column activists received support from Daniel Bax, for whom the subject of his Taz section, Germany, cannot be Islamic enough, or Wolfgang Benz, who managed to give the Berlin Center for Research on Anti-Semitism, which was entrusted to him, the coup de grace. You really don't have to go to the archives and do lengthy research to denounce this phenomenon of left-wing German criticism of Islam as untrue. Even the lead article of one of the numerous online editions of the Sturmer, 1934-38, justifies global anti-Semitism and its murderous discharges under the title Self-Help for Tormented Peoples. The focus here is primarily on the actions of the Mohammedans, namely the pogroms against the Jews in Palestine, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, which the Sturmer saw as laudable. But the Sturmer also eagerly emphasized that this had nothing to do with Islam. As with all pogroms, the Weltjude is eager to portray the uprising in Algiers and Tunis as the work of religious Mohammedan fanatics. The Arab pogroms were certainly a role model. Today, the Mohammedans in Algiers are rising up. Tomorrow, it could be the whole world. Islam appears only marginally in the Sturmer, which is only logical, as the first principle of the Sturmer was, this Sturmer does not fight against the Jewish religion, but against the Jewish race, 1934-1, or the Jewish question is a racial question, 1942-11, and the same motto was also used to define Friends. The Sturmer was by no means free of Talmud exegesis. In contrast, however, there was always a simultaneous focus on the public denunciation of individuals who were labeled as wine, perfume, Talmud, or abortion Jews. Central to this were portrait photos that were captioned with, "This is what he looks like." Those photos were much more dangerous than the caricatures, because the former were precisely what proved that the Jews were hardly recognizable as such, as every second signature emphasized. Everyone secretly knew that the caricatures were nonsense. Only when they were personalized did they unfold their disgusting potential, as in the case of the countless ritual murder legends. The Sturmer referred theologically almost exclusively to the Talmud, the criminal textbook 1937-10, and in particular to the Gemara. The focus on the purely human components of the Talmud is programmatic, as it was on these that the falsification of quotations could best be carried out in perpetuity. Above all, however, the Talmud quotations were always quoted without their refutation, which is why the argumentation of the striker on the basis of the Talmud could be so easily refuted in factual form. Because here, too, there is no completely free bingo, as left-wing critics of religion repeatedly insinuate. A popular example among anti-Semites is the sentence, "Non-Jews are not human." Those who cite only this omit the page-long refutations of the sentence. Jewish doctrine, on the other hand, as Johann Sfar puts it in his rabbi's mouth, is thesis, antithesis, 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 antithesis. And it was precisely this dialectical competence, alongside the chosenness of the Jewish people, that got Muhammad worked up. However, the truth content of a religion can be judged far beyond its correct but abstract definition as the opium of the people. The situation is similar with criticism of religion. Just as anti-Semites have been quoting or falsifying from the Talmud for a long time, apologists of Islam today are doing the same with the Quran and the Hadith, as well as both with the Bible. The spirit of Stryker has reached the Orient. 1940-34 was the headline of the Sturmer in 1940, and the reverse was also true, because Stryker's gaze had finally reached the Orient. Now there were also photos from Palestine with captions such as, "This Arab was murdered by a Jewish shotgun woman in Jerusalem," or "A Jewish professor, as a soldier in Palestine, is supposed to defend a camp against the evil Arabs," 1941. In return, the Sturmer stated that Arabs were also Semites, and that hatred of Jews should therefore not be called anti-Semitism, 1941-13. The following issue stated that the Jews had been paid for the stab in the back they had given Germany in the First World War with the Balfour Declaration, only to denounce Zionism in the next article because it meant a bloody time of suffering for the Arab population in Palestine, who were not willing to give way to the Jewish immigration streams without a fight. The victory of German and Italian arms will also bring freedom to the oppressed Arabs, 1941-14. After all, a Jew was to blame for France annexing Algeria, 1942-17. The Sturmer had high hopes for the Iraqi pro-German putsch, 1941-22, which quickly erupted into pogroms against Jews and led to the murder and expulsion of Jewish communities. Finally, Stryker excluded the Jews from the Semitic alliance in favor of the Arabs, as this was not acceptable to the Arabs, 1941-25, only to lament the unprecedented tragedy of the Egyptian people due to the Suez Canal in the same issue, but rejoiced at the murders of Jews in Palestine. Whereas in 1939 the Jewish terror against the Arabs in Palestine was still lamented. Quote, "In an open and honest fight, the Arabs would have beaten and finished off the Jews in the shortest possible time. Then Judaism in Palestine would be wiped out in no time." End of quote. The Sturmer was above all folkish and racist Arab-friendly. Stryker discovered as new friends the pure Semites, namely Arabs who were fighting against Zionism and Judaism, especially in Iraq, which is why the Sturmer also spoke out in favor of the Pan-Arabic Empire, 1942-5-7. On the occasion of a bomb attack on a synagogue in Cairo, 1939-30, it said, "The people of the Arabs, who created such a great culture in the Middle Ages, have also already recognized that living together with the Jews is impossible. The Arabs, the best representatives of the pure Semitic race, have awakened." In its anti-imperialism, Der Sturmer was above all obsessed with the Arabs and especially the Bedouins, and to a certain extent displayed a sympathetic indifference towards Islam. But Sturmer also emphasized the solidarity of Christianity with Islam as international religions against national or folkish Judaism, 1940-42. However, Christianity, like human rights later on, had stood in the way of anti-Semitism for a long time, 1942-12, whereas in Islam or the Arab Empire, and they did not have to invent this, there had already been an obligation to identify Jews in the 8th century, 1942-19. Stryker warned that Judaism was deceiving and exploiting Islam, 1937-10. Now, Stryker and his paper were by no means popular in Nazi circles. If one considers the numerous battles for direction, one would have to say, according to the enemies of abstraction, that there is no such thing as National Socialism or Islam, which would of course be outrageous nonsense. What Julius Stryker was basically right about, however, without it being credited to him in the slightest as a defense, were his statements at the Nuremberg trial, in which he explained the parallels between his writings and those of Martin Luther, who would also be on trial if he were still alive. This would have to be supplemented by the eternal role model of Muslims called Muhammad, who would have to be very careful of U.S. drones today. But Stryker, who quoted extensively from Luther's writings in the Sturmer, already concealed his criticism of Islam there. But even in this, Stryker did justice to the spirit of Luther, who regarded the Turks as the third danger after the Hungarians and Mongols, but felt a great deal of sympathy for them, unlike the Jews. Quote, "The Turks atone more credibly. The Turks are much more convincing in their ascetic achievements. They are much more impressive with regard to the religious system, asceticism. So they are basically the better Catholics, in the sense of a religion characterized by works, by religious achievements." End of quote. The discipline and order of Islam in public affairs served for long stretches as a foil for his reformation. He was only disturbed by the domestic immoralities, such as polygamy, and above all the lack of Christocentricity. However, Christianity was to be healed by the nature of Islam. Adolf Hitler would later take this up in a slightly different form. The actual preoccupation with Islam did not take place in the Stürmer, but in all other publications, such as the Völkisch Observer, Das Reich, and the magazine Signal, or the SS newspaper Das Schwarzkorps. Countless Islamophile articles and pamphlets appeared everywhere, which were by no means only written by the Mufti, who is often cited as a single black sheep. Some of the German Islamophiles, such as Johann von Leers, later converted to Islam and continued their activities in Arab countries after the war without much interruption. However, the majority of the writers there were able to continue their careers in Germany after 45 foot, whether as journalists, diplomats, or academics. Von Leers wrote Judaism and Islam as opposites, in which he mocks the deadly hatred of the Jews even after 1,400 years against the man who brought the youngest and in many respects most successful world religion into being, in order to then justify the destruction and expulsion of the Arab Jews in complete conformity with Islam, as this had prevented the Jewish conquest of the Orient. In other words, the Islamization of Arabia had prevented its Judaization. Such arguments can be found in the Islamic tradition since time immemorial. The problem is primarily that he hardly had to falsify anything in order to do justice to both the Islamic and the National Socialist tradition. Muhammad largely replaced Jesus for the Nazis because he was more successful. This selling point characterizes Islam, which has always been political, very well. A single article appeared in the Völkischer Beobachter that took a critical view of Islam, 1944. In other words, it compared it to Bolshevism, which was otherwise accused of oppressing and raping Islam. Countless high-ranking party officials immediately reacted to this, calling for tougher censorship because Helmut Sundermann's article had insulted Muslims. Goebbels had actually already ordered Islam-friendly reporting in 1938. As a rule, the German Reich acted as the liberator or patron of Islam, a role that no one other than Germany, in essence, the Imperial Germany, ever intended to assume. All of this can be seen as interchangeable signifiers, but this puts it on the same level as the Stürmer, whose subtitle advertised it as a German weekly to fight for the truth. But you fight for the truth with Foucault, Gramsci, or Stryker. Anyone who cares about the truth, on the other hand, would fight for it. And if this is a fight at all, it will certainly not be a German one. To this day, the Nazis' reference to Islam is often seen as completely deliberate instrumentalization and propaganda, which is usually backed up with one or two quotes from Goebbels. This German propaganda via countless brochures, leaflets, and above all radio broadcasts should not be underestimated, especially not in the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Allies, on the other hand, refrained from addressing Muslims as Muslims or even Islam for long periods of time, as they rightly feared that they would not win this propagandistic conflict. Only the USA tried and was the only one to announce a jihad of freedom for a short while, which would have looked bad on the European colonial powers, who rather addressed their subjects as subjects, which was historically just successful. The Allies benefited from the fact that Italian colonial aspirations stood in the way of Germany's anti-imperialist and pro-Islamic approaches. These were very successful among the clergy, but missed the more national political upper classes, while it was already recognized that there was potential in the deeply religious lower classes. Another problem for the Nazis was that they were too eager to use Hitler as an Islamic messiah, and to achieve this they embarked on contortions that no longer worked. However, too little attention is paid to the fact that National Socialism also received something from Islam. This is also the central weakness of David Mottedal's work, which is otherwise very readable, especially due to its wealth of material. The publisher writes about the work. For the first time, David Modell presents a comprehensive account of the Nazi regime's policy towards Islam. Internationally acclaimed, the historian illustrates that and how the Third Reich presented itself as the patron of Muslims. The Nazi elite instrumentalized their faith for geopolitical and military purposes. End quote. Certain private remarks made by Hitler are particularly revealing in this context. For example, he regretted the repulsion of the Islamic conquest at Tours and Poitiers because the Arabs had thereby imposed a religion on the Germanic peoples which, through its doctrine of spreading the faith by the sword and subjugating all peoples to this faith, was tailor-made for the Germanic peoples. End of quote. With the help of a certain climate theory, he then imagined a situation in which not the Arabs, but the Muslimized Germanic tribes would eventually have stood at the head of this Islamic world empire. The Islamization of the Occident was definitely an image from Hitler's wet dream, who felt hindered by Christianity. Mein Kampf had been published in Arabic in large excerpts since 1936 and circulated in the Orient. It was a book about which Churchill quite rightly said that it was a new Quran of faith and war, pompous, long-winded, shapeless, but pregnant with its message. His contemporary, the Germanic psychologist C. G. Jung, also recognized this. We do not know whether Hitler intends to found a new Islam. He is already on the way to doing so. He is like Muhammad. The sentiment in Germany is Islamic, belligerent and Islamic. This could be the historical future. But the two differed fundamentally in their assessment. Even the young Churchill noted of Islam, there is no more retrograde force in the world. Among other things, he identified the disgusting disposition of women as the basis of continuing slavery, and was very well able to separate the faith from individual Muslims. But the influence of religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it, and indeed, until the Islamic faith has ceased to have a great power over men. Contemporaries from various camps recognized the connection between Islam and Nazism very well and very early on. The Nazis sometimes had doubts about the racial constitution of the Orientals, as in Mein Kampf, but never about Islam. Himmler also loved Islam and wanted to visit Islamic countries after the war to study the religion on site. This is not surprising, as he was able to discover his marriage of peace in the polygamy of Islam as something that actually existed and was practiced. Many high-ranking officials came to the conclusion that with Islam, there was no need for the Nazis, and no need for Italy, which had been given too much consideration in the Islamic question, as Hitler remarked in his last days. German Islamophilia was enforced against almost all European allies, above all Romanians, Croats, and Italians, who were repeatedly reprimanded for their Islamophobia, and this repeatedly shows the extent to which ideology prevailed over rationality of purpose. Criticism of Islam cannot simply forget that the Nazis soon had a serious interest in Islam, which was no longer completely absorbed in an instrumental approach and which was somewhat countered by Islam. Hitler expressed this Janus-facedness very aptly in one of his last Führerbunker monologues. Just think of what we could have done to help them, even to incite them, as it would have been in our duty as well as in our interest. End quote. The self-imposed moral duty to defend Islam is ultimately a very German affair. In general, it is not appropriate to speak out too quickly when only words of grief, condolences, or solidarity would be appropriate. But the news hype is already underway, of course, and in response to this and its speculation about the perpetrator and his motivation, the Röberon wrote, understandably, but wrongly, "We are not trying to understand him. We are not trying to humanize his murder." End quote. Understanding, however, does not per se mean humanizing in the sense of excusing, or rather, one would do well to remember that the perpetrator was human, and not a monster beyond humanity. But what is more important is the following. Firstly, the rejection of understanding is a blatant luxury, because the survivors and the relatives and friends of those murdered will ask themselves why they were killed. Leaving them alone with these questions does not do them justice, despite expressions of condolences. On the other hand, it appears to be a reflexive defense. No one who has quite rightly and publicly defended or expressed the view that Islam is the stupidest or even most dangerous religion can now, no matter how ostentatiously he or she has condemned acts of violence, stand up when 50 Muslims are simply slaughtered in the most southeastern of all the countries that together make up the West, and say that this has nothing to do with one of them. Above all, no one can do this before they have even given it a thought. And it doesn't matter at all whether the victims included women and children. However relevant this may be from a psychological point of view. You can't do justice to the victims by focusing on them. That blatantly contradicts their innocence. Critics of Islam are not to blame for the attack either, but they may have a certain responsibility and thus, above all, a duty to bring it to light because any reasonable criticism of Islam has named and criticized some of the things that Tarrant cited as motives for his act. Be it the mention of Arab Islamic slavery, the collective sexual violence of Rotherham et al., or on New Year's Eve in Cologne, or similar phenomena. Even his characterization of the Battle of Tours and Poitiers up to the defeat of the Islamic armies before Vienna as European Christian defensive battles against Islam is not simply wrong, as some are now rashly thinking of interjecting. For Goethe, who is often invoked as an apologist for Islam, even the Crusades were a defense against the historical threat of Islamization. Even Breivik referred to Henrik M. Broder, albeit in a mediated way. Such references naturally lend themselves magnificently to branding everything that delusional racists refer to as false, racist, and as part or the basis of the crime. It is due to the shock of the crime and the suffering caused that the attempt at understanding may take on a certain self-justifying character, leaving one with no choice but to simply formulate it transparently. There is no question that Tarrant was most likely an individual perpetrator, but an individual perpetrator who was very much in contact with various people and groups who could and can grant, as well as a fascist racist who supported his argumentation exclusively with Wikipedia sources, i.e. on a decidedly overall social basis. Through these references to sources, the perpetrator conjures up the hope that his actions can be understood simply by looking at Wikipedia articles, in addition to the usual jargon used within the scene. Verberon went on to write, "Once again, it is clear that there can be no dialogue with Nazis. There can only be a fight against them." End of quote. In contrast, the mayor of Christchurch, in an appeal dangerously reminiscent of the phrases used after Islamic attacks, warned, quote, "His voice is the voice of hate, and there is only one way that society can respond to the voice of hate. They come together in love, empathy, and kindness." End quote. The Ruhr Barons are quite right that it is not love, but struggle that is appropriate in the face of such figures. However, this struggle needs to define the enemy, and this includes listening to the fascist monologue and, not least, practicing empathy with the act and the perpetrator in order to sharpen our hatred of them, i.e., to turn hatred into more than just hatred, namely knowledge, on which the struggle against these fascists should be based. It may come as a bit of a surprise, or may only reinforce others in their view of the world, when one now starts to emphasize the need for differentiation, while in the case of Islamic attacks, this demand for differentiation is referred to as appeasement. The only question is what is actually being differentiated. It is not about the perpetrator's childhood, youth, family, biographical background, social situation, etc., nor is it about his psychological constitution per se. In other words, it is not about all those factors that are constantly cited in order to de-Islamize and thus relativize Islamic attacks and attackers. The problem is rather that compared to the relative uniformity of Islamic attacks, in terms of justification, method, organization, etc., this attack is not even inherently Islamic. This attack is not even consistent in itself. However, this does not mean that it was not highly orchestrated. What can be said at the moment is that the attack can be broken down into 3 levels, which, it should be emphasized, cannot be separated from each other. Summarized in one sentence, the attack was decidedly anti-Muslim and, at the latest in its staging, anti-Islamic. The manifesto, on the other hand, is strictly speaking neither of these but genuinely racist, or more precisely a white supremacist or white power document. First of all, the eco part has no serious role. However much the perpetrator claims the self-designation of eco-fascist for himself. For him, climate change is linked to overpopulation, which is merely an extension of his fear of biological alienation. Anyone who now appears and declares that this perpetrator is simply the logical extension of the protest against climate change can obviously not read, and also reveals their own paranoia about those same paranoid protests, which have nothing to do with criticism. The eco part has a meaning, but more on that below. The manifesto is also only marginally anti-Semitic. Jews are really viewed here as racist rather than truly anti-Semitic. A Jew in Israel is a good Jew, according to Tarrant. The so-called structurally anti-Semitic moment is also extremely marginal, albeit present. This is much more central to the keyword giver of the Great Exchange, Renaud Camus, than in Tarrant's manifesto, which is much more likely to cite racist pseudoscientific arguments than to subscribe to Camus' conspiracy fetish. None of these moments have any serious functional significance, either in the manifesto or in fact. One after the other. The manifesto is a thoroughly ethno-pluralist or rather ethno-nationalist fascist document, in which the delusional panic about the high birth rate of all non-whites is expressed as the central motif in the very first sentence, repeated 3 times. It's the birth rates. This is to be taken seriously, not in the sense that it would have any rational content, but rather that it was the content par excellence for the perpetrator. The Great Exchange, white genocide are the leitmotifs to which everything is subordinated. The manifesto, written in the style of a FAQ self-interview, certainly has anti-Islamic traits. For the most part, however, it boils down to the idea that a Muslim in the Orient is a good Muslim, while one in the Occident is an invader, and therefore above all part of the non-white world population that is pushing into white countries. But a specific part. At the same time, the attack itself, the choice of victims and the location of the mass murder, and its orchestration is a thoroughly anti-Muslim to Islamic document that can be read as such and therefore also understood. The euphemistic and somewhat very postmodern-sounding designation of the barbaric mass murder as a document, or whatever one might call it, is undeniably a reification of horror. However, it would be absurd to think that characterizing the perpetrator as non-human, a monster, or the like is a more immediate and, above all, truer assessment that would do the act more justice. Tarrant did what he did, and he did it in the way he did it because he knew that the message it contained could and would be understood. The names and places he wrote on his gun, the Serbo-fascist song in the background, and the recording of the live stream are part of the attack and not just external decoration. The staging extends to the method and means of the attack, namely the choice of firearms. The explanations about the choice of his specific murder tools may be seen as a rationalization, and this is probably not entirely wrong. However, there is an idea of considerable explosive force in the calculation of the debates surrounding the Second Amendment. The fact that New Zealand immediately tightened its gun laws is, with all due understanding, a knee-jerk reaction to the attack, which to a certain extent prolongs it. However, New Zealand did not make itself an accomplice, because Tarrant was quite explicitly aiming at the USA, where a civil war may break out over the right to bear arms, which he wants to revoke through his act, and which is intended to bring about the balkanization of the USA. His goal, conveyed through the right to bear arms, was the end of the melting pot, and beyond that, decidedly the weakening of the USA and its ability to intervene worldwide. Many reactions seem above all to be a defense against the disgusting truth contained in Tarrant's sentence. The attack was not an attack on diversity, but an attack in the name of diversity. The Great Exchange only means an Islamization of Europe or the West to a limited extent. In his image, the latter is merely part of the former, albeit an important part. Muslims as the enemy and, above all, as the explicit target of the attack, were by no means simply interchangeable. In response to the question, why attack Muslims if all high fertility immigrants are the issue, he stated, historical, societal, and statistical reasons. They are the most despised group of invaders in the West. Attacking them receives the greatest level of support. They're also one of the strongest groups, with high fertility, high in group preference, and a will to conquer. End of quote. For the act itself, he apparently needed, and in an instinctive way, to focus on the allegedly to actually militant part of the invaders, as he calls all non-white immigrants, refugees, etc. He did not even mention the birth jihad declared by Islamists against Israel and, in part, against Europe. He is only interested in Islam as a block on, and on the surface, he is completely indifferent to what goes on inside it, i.e., what Islam does to Muslims. He is interested in the warring fringes when they affect whiteness. His subsequent partisanship for other peoples of the world is to be regarded as mendacious garbage. Furthermore, he sees Islam as a form of organization of non-white people that encourages them to have even higher birth rates than they already have. The central anti-Islamic moment, however, is the imagined revenge for a 1,300-year struggle. He imagined his act as such revenge, which attempted to appear as an eye for an eye and thus as a principle of equivalence. Tarrant literally needed the specific child victim of an Islamic attack, Ebba Akerlund, in order to be allowed to kill Muslim children himself. This was a negative articulation of his conscience. Only the reference to the real threat posed by Islam, which he heightened imaginatively and also biologized, provided him with the relief of those pangs of conscience and the discharge of his murderous racism. If he wanted to kill non-white people, he could only kill Muslims. The equally possible reversal of this interpretation, according to which he merely used his racism as an instrumental cover for his hatred of Islam, seems illogical or unlikely. The fact that, according to his own statement, he only really hated the converts, namely as race traitors, is entirely credible. He would also have a sufficiently concrete enemy image with a purely frontal position against Islam and/or Muslims, which he could derive and justify historically and from current grievances. It simply seems unlikely that the concrete nature of the act should be legitimized in an instrumental way by a much vaguer, more abstract ideology. What is latent in the attack itself is what is manifest in the manifesto, and vice versa. The attack is the act that is to be interpreted. At this stage, it seems as if the thoroughly delusional translation work, which sought to bridge the clear tension between manifesto and deed, is reminiscent of the dream work, which ends with a compromise in which, for example, the church converted into a mosque becomes a tangible and vulnerable symbol of the foreign racially occupied homeland, with the name Christchurch, indicating that the city was by no means chosen by chance. This motif appears once again in the desired liberation of Hagia Sophia, whereby this, too, is only symbolic of the fact that Europe, as a geographical united front, must become racially pure. In other words, all Turks beyond the Bosporus, and after they have been thrown onto NATO, are completely legitimate Turks in his eyes. In this sense, it is a striking feature that should not be underestimated that he carried the anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic moment, especially in the lettering on his weapon, with him in the truest sense. It seems as if it was intended to give him confidence in carrying out the crime because he did not fully believe his own delusions about the birth rate. This lack of belief in his own madness led, for example, to the fact that as a birth rate fetishist, he said he was not homophobic and had nothing against homosexuals as long as they were loyal to their people, whereby he did not even think of the obvious idea that gays and lesbians are literally betraying the battle of birth rates. He himself announces that he deleted the original manifesto, which was well over 200 pages long, in a moment of unbridled self-criticism, whereupon he had to rewrite the version that now exists. Even the self-ironic touches do not seem to be based on distance from the content of the manifesto, but rather on the strong libidinous, but certainly not unbroken, attachment to this content. He needed perpetrators, victims, places, and role models that he could carry with him and look at. The lettering on the weapon was probably not only applied for his audience, but as an assurance for himself. They did it too, he apparently had to say to himself again and again, both in relation to Muslim killers and in relation to Western Muslim killers. His war against Islam appears as a rationalization of the underlying racial hatred, which appears as fear of the amorphous mass of invaders, which as an amorphous mass is already psychologically simply overwhelming and intangible. Without this rationalization, he might not have been able to make his madness tangible in concrete goals or to carry out his deed at all. By no means did he experience a spontaneous, shocking awakening in Europe, as he himself wrote in the manifesto, but his travels through Europe took place because he knew that he would encounter the Muslims there. He had long been aware of the grievances from the internet, according to him, the only place where the truth resides. He probably knew exactly which cities or districts he would have to travel to in order to confirm his image of the superiority of the invaders. His apparent research trips are therefore a prime example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Muslims as victims were his human and personal compromise between underlying racial hatred and the hatred of Islam that rationalized and, above all, channeled it. One thing should not be forgotten. His rationalization could refer to criticism of Islam. The fact that he made endless distortions, that he turned criticism into its opposite, that he instrumentalized it in the truest sense cannot deny this simple fact. The excuse that one would only criticize Islam and not Muslims is absurd, because of course one criticizes Islam as lived by Muslims and thus also Muslims themselves in their thoughts and actions. The editor of the magazine Spiked, who probably quite rightly described the attack in a comment in the title as the barbarism of identity politics, is also part of the defense against any hint of spontaneous self-criticism. He wants to turn against voices claiming that criticism of Muslim immigration or of Islam generates this kind of violent hatred. But he denies that Tarrant was quite functionally speculating on the hatred of Islam or the criticism of Islam by numerous Westerners or the genuine racism that may be concealed underneath. Quote, "They are the most despised group of invaders in the West. Attacking them receives the greatest level of support." End of quote. The lines in Spiked magazine, which immediately find responsibility in the political opponent, are, although true, treacherous signs of capitulation to the powerlessness that arises from the fact that one cannot begin to give up the truth even in the face of the bloodbath. Those who are only now reviewing their arguments have no less of a problem than those who immediately have to stand up to emphasize that this has nothing to do with their criticism, that the perpetrator is only Islamophobic, etc. In the latter case, it seems as if people are already psychologically arming themselves against the realization that such acts of terrorism will also occur in the future, and probably more frequently, and that their perpetrators could in some cases refer to a reasonable criticism of Islam. Quote, "The only person to blame for the massacres in New Zealand is the man who carried them out. No identitarian politician or activist or commentator is responsible for this." But, Spike continues, "This highly treacherous, but of course takes back everything that was written before it and does not reflect the fact that one could just as well, and possibly with no less justification formulate. No criticism of Muslim immigration or of Islam generates this kind of violent hatred. But," end of quote. Criticism of Islam does not suddenly become wrong because someone was able to commit the act in the first place in the hope of support, sympathy, or similar from this side. The fact that the responsibility of criticism of Islam arises largely from the lack of willingness, not only on the left, to speak these truths in general and to allow them to have an enlightening effect, or that the Islam-friendly to Islam-trivializing wing of society, as well as the fans of identity politics, will not take responsibility, should not be taken as an excuse to do the same in defense. This would mean making criticism of Islam practical. The Muslims murdered in Christchurch were victims as a mixture. Both non-white people and representatives of Islam were targeted. Even if the act of terrorism was obviously primarily racist, i.e. directed against non-white people, it is probably not justified to regard this as the actual motivation, and therefore the only valid one, and thus to make an absolute separation between the two moments, however pleasant this might be. It is so obvious that the perpetrator would not have come to his deed without the underlying racial delusion that it must be irrelevant here for the time being, especially if Muslims were slaughtered because they were Muslims. Tarrant uses far fewer Christian motives than Breivik, whom he cited as a central source of inspiration and legitimization. He also argued far less culturally critical. In the case of Breivik, who introduced his manifesto with a detailed critique of the Frankfurt School and Marcuse in particular, if one refers to critical theory, one was in a way declared to be the main enemy oneself. It is important to emphasize that Breivik, contrary to popular characterizations, is not or was not a Christian fundamentalist, but in fact a follower of Odin. For Breivik, the Crusades were, not even completely falsely, a Germanic act under a Christian flag. The latter was used as an instrument for European unification in a joint act of violence, which is the only benefit or value of Christianity for the self-proclaimed modern crusader and his followers. There is indeed an Islam envy expressed in the imagination of the Christian Viking voyage, which even Tarrant cannot deny. Quote, "Expecting immigrants to assimilate to a dying decadent culture is laughable. Who would willingly leave their own strong, dominant, and rising culture to join an elderly, decaying, degenerate culture? What culture would entice a man? One of traditions, beauty, architecture, art, and prosperity, or a culture of decay, self-hatred, childlessness, disorder, and nihilism? End quote. In the aversion to individualism, it becomes clear that the counter-jihad is really an attempt at counter-jihad that is tired of civilization and not a fight of civilization against jihad. At the same time, there are massive differences between the two forms of terrorism that make it impossible to reduce them to Islam envy. The first difference between Islamists on the one hand and Breivik and Terran on the other is the massive rejection of the possibility of assimilation by the latter. This forms a certain contrast to Islamists in that Islamic ideology, at least ideally, aims for subjugation, and thus a barbaric form of assimilation, which does not mean that they are free of racism and fantasies of annihilation, as IS has amply demonstrated, or that Islam itself is free of racist ideas, or that annihilation in a suicide attack takes on a completely different and above all psychological level of meaning. And it is precisely in anti-Semitism that this mission of subjugation softens in favor of pure annihilation. In the case of figures such as Breivik or Tarrant, on the other hand, the annihilation of everything foreign appears much more as an end in itself, also in ideological terms. The perpetrator's intention, which latently limits this purpose, that their victim should possibly be induced by the crime to evade the murder by moving away, i.e. leaving the areas imagined as white, points to the second difference. Secondly, the all-dominant racist motives of the counter-jihadists mean that for Breivik and Tarrant, in contrast to the Islamists, there is no contrast between the house of peace and the house of war. Although they see or imagine themselves as crusaders, they reject interventions in non-European, foreign countries and have no intention of conquering Jerusalem or the rest of the world. To them, their house, i.e. their homeland, is the house of war, as long as it is not purely European, i.e. white. With regard to climate change, Terrence suddenly expresses a global claim when he writes, "The environment is being destroyed by overpopulation. We Europeans are one of the groups that are not overpopulating the world. The invaders are the ones overpopulating the world. Kill the invaders, kill the overpopulation, and by doing so save the environment." End quote. Of course, it is illogical, even in the twisted racist logic, to think that global overpopulation can be defeated in Europe. So there is certainly an element of global annihilation here, but in this manifesto it contrasts with the rest of the argument in a way that cannot be resolved. It is precisely this that should push the whole eco part even further to the margins in terms of its significance. At the same time, it expresses the certain universal moment of the fascists, insofar as it reveals that the racist defensive struggle they envisage would be universal in time, i.e. permanent. For Tarrant, climate change caused by overpopulation, especially too much of the wrong world population, is thus recognized by him as the cause of flight, which in his case is synonymous with the cause of invasion. This quasi-scientific moment largely replaces the moment of active conspiracy in Camus thinking. To put it bluntly, these fascists are met with universalism, the Islamists with universalism. This is of course a strong generalization, because Islam is of course universally anti-universalist, i.e. only spatially and temporally universal, and also highly particularist is required. However, there is a difference which should not be underestimated between today's fascists who stand up in defense of a specific piece of land and its connection to a supposedly specific blood community and Islamists who claim to be worldwide. In both cases, the critique of Islam, i.e. the Enlightenment, tends to be closer to the Islamists than to the counter-jihadists, in that it is directly opposed to Islamism and Islam. With the same universal claim, it focuses on liberation against Islamic subjugation, while Breivik and Tarrant are really more likely to find their counterpart in space-fixed identity politics. For Tarrant, Islam is in some ways the antithesis of Breivik's Christianity due to its ability to organize the invaders. In both cases, the underlying racial aspect is the real thing, whereas for Breivik, Christianity united the white Europeans, i.e. those Germanic tribes who would only bash their own heads in without that ideological superstructure. For Tarrant, Islam unites a considerable proportion of non-whites. Christianity is hardly ever invoked by Tarrant. Rather, it is now ecologism as a quasi-religion that may unite as Christianity did in the Middle Ages. This is the only and extremely weak function that ecologism has in the text. The lack of binding power of this substitute religion for racist agitation means that it hardly appears in quantitative terms. This points to a weakness of these racists and fascists, which consists above all in the fact that they lack a common ideology, which means that they lack a common document, such as the Quran, and for the most part even common premises, such as certain mosques. This is probably where the manifesto fetish comes from. Of course, they have numerous points of reference, manifestos, etc. But none of these have sufficient authority anymore. Hence Tarrant's strong focus on the one issue of birth rates in comparison and in contrast to Breivik's relatively multi-layered manifesto. The longing for an issue that everyone believes in, to which everyone is committed, points to a central problem of today's fascists and racists. They are too diverse and fortunately, so far, have too few channeling moments, which is why today they lack the leader principle as well as the state-destroying and non-state building moment. The actual seizure of power by these figures seems, at present, unlikely. It is not without reason that the main form of organization is networking on the internet. However, this characteristic of their weakness is also their certain strength. The elusiveness of online networking makes it difficult to fight against them even where the will or willingness to do so exists. Of course, one can point out that these fascists pose little danger to a society as a whole or to a political system, but this is little or no consolation for the victims of the attacks. The failure to recognize the different potential of Western fascists and Islamists in general is probably largely due to a lack of knowledge of languages such as Arabic. Otherwise, we would know that the drastic nature of the content, which we uncovered after painstaking research by clandestinely smuggling ourselves into a closed racist chat group, corresponds to the content of school textbooks and morning shows in many Arab countries. This openness correlates with the far higher number of Islamic attacks worldwide, which hardly anyone is interested in, as otherwise one might conclude that the difference is not merely quantitative. Breivik and Tarrant differ from Islamic assassins in their will to survive. They want to continue working after the crime, even if it is from prison. They have, of course, accepted the possibility of their death, but it is not the declared and desired, partial goal of the act. Rather, survival and continued impact is part of the attack itself. They have no paradise, and they know it, apart from post-fame or post-effect, which they still want to experience in prison. While Islamic assassins, if you ever get your hands on them alive, are seriously punished by prison sentences, also in psychological terms, by denying them paradise and their role as martyrs for the time being, there are massive difficulties in dealing with Breivik and Tarrant, as it is unfortunately not possible to impose an absolute contact ban on them out of respect for their human dignity, for example. This would be one of the key issues that the entire West would have to address, as attacks of this kind are very likely to increase. The fact that the New Zealand Prime Minister, whose sympathy is highly impressive and commendable in itself, is waddling around in a headscarf as a sign of solidarity and encouraging the rest of the population to follow suit is pure capitulation, which only shows that the attack has not been understood. With this act, she is showing solidarity with Islam, while the attacker did not murder Muslims because they were wearing headscarves. Robert Bowers was really unlucky. After he had not been able to kill nearly as many Jews as he had planned thanks to the quick reaction of the residents of the Tree of Life Community Center, he survived instead of dying a martyr's death, not only slightly injured. In the hospital, his boss then introduced himself to him as Dr. Cohen. As a member of the community that mourned 11 dead, he wanted to see the murderer to understand what drives such a person. Cohen told CRN, "I have no answers." I asked him, "How are you?" He seemed exhausted and said he was okay. Then I introduced myself as Dr. Cohen, head of the hospital, and then I left. The FBI agent guarding him looked at me and asked, "How could you do that?" I couldn't. End quote. The FBI agent was also Jewish. Cohen continued, "The gentleman didn't strike me as a member of Mensa, Association of the Highly Gifted. He listens to the static, he listens to the static." This noise told him that his people were to be slaughtered. He thought it was time to get up and do something. He is completely confused, and the words mean things. They're words that make people do things like that. End quote. In the days between the assassination and the midterm elections, American Jews were more present on all television channels and in all newspapers than they had rarely been in recent years. At least as long as they were repeating what many wanted to hear: Trump is to blame. That there is a mediation between words and deeds in the subject, and that the noise must first and foremost be interpreted by the subject in order to come to a conclusion, and that it is a further step for the subject to upgrade the conclusion to a call to action. This mediation, which Cohen seems to have been well aware of, was abridged with political interest. All that remained of Cohen's words in the media later was the last sentence. This is how the noise works. The fact that Jewish doctors and Jewish nursing staff were involved in Bauer's care exerted an uncanny fascination on the American media, from CNN to the New York Times to Fox News. A mysterious Jewish nurse was reported, and somehow it was found strange that Jews could be so human as to obey laws, as if that were not their unique selling point, and professionally abstract from their concern, as if that were not the basic condition of their survival. After all, it was the male nurse, there is only the feminine word in American English, Ari Mahler, who outed himself as the Jewish nurse via Facebook. Quote, "I'm that Jewish nurse. The one people are talking about in connection with the Pittsburgh massacre that took 11 lives, the intensive care nurse who took care of Robert Bowers, who was still shouting death to Jews as he was hospitalized. The Jewish nurse who ran into the treatment room to save his life. When I was a child, the adjective Jewish was always associated with a derogatory label, so I feel embarrassed when people suddenly see them as lovable. To distract from my religion and make it more accessible to people that I am Jewish, especially as the son of a rabbi, I often said as an adult, I'm not that religious. That was supposed to convey, don't be afraid, I'm not that Jewish and therefore not that different from you. And all of a sudden, people didn't look at me as strangely as they had seconds before I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism as a child. I found scribbles on my desk with my family being taken to the gas chambers, swastikas on my locker, messages that said, Die Jew, love Hitler. The fact that this mass murder took place doesn't surprise me. To be honest, it's only a matter of time before the next one. History belies any hope for change. I long for it, but in today's climate, neither mutual respect nor tolerance, not even decency, thrive. Even before this mass murder, there was no indication that things could be different. The FBI and the Southern Poverty Law Center have pointed out that although Jews make up only 2% of the U.S. population, 60% of all religious hate crimes are directed at them. I don't know why people hate us so much, but the underbelly of anti-Semitism seems to be thriving. So, here I am, the Jewish nurse who took care of Robert Bowers. I've seen them talk about me on CNN, Fox News, Anderson Cooper, PBS, and the local stations. I read the articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post that mentioned me. The fact that I did my job, a job that requires mercy and empathy more than anything else, becomes headline news because I am Jewish. Even more so because my father is a rabbi, to be honest. I didn't see evil when I looked into Robert Bowers' eyes. I saw something else. I can't go into details because I'm sworn to secrecy. I can tell you that as his caregiver or anyone else's, I give my care with kindness, take my actions with empathy, and without regard to who you may be if you are not in need of my care. So it was with Robert Bowers, who just committed mass murder. The Robert Bowers who panicked me less than an hour before he was admitted. My parents could have been 2 of the 11 victims. I'm sure he had no idea I was Jewish. Why would he thank a Jewish orderly whom he would have shot in the head 15 minutes earlier without remorse? I didn't say a word to him about my religion. I decided not to tell him the whole time. I wanted him to experience mercy. I decided to show empathy. I felt the best way for a Jew to honor the victims was to show him that he was wrong. Should he find out that I am Jewish? Does it matter? Isn't the better question what it means to you? Love. That's why I did it. Love as action is more powerful than words, and love in the face of evil gives hope to others. It is the manifestation of humanity. It affirms why we are all here. The purpose of life is to give meaning to life, and love is the supreme force that binds all living beings together. I don't care what Robert Bowers thinks, but for you reading this, love is the only message I want to bring to you. If what I do means little, love means everything. End quote. Ari Mahler felt a compulsion to justify why he acted as he did on the basis of his professional and personal ethics. Leaving aside the ideological exaggerations of love and empathy, Mahler is not describing what he is now being praised for everywhere. He has no illusions about anti-Semitism. He reminds us that in Jewish ethics, no one is ever no longer human. The panic he felt at the realistic suspicion that his parents might be among the victims does not make Mahler mutate into a Jewish Superman. Rather, his treatment of the murderer reveals a cold professionalism that understands kindness and empathy as skills necessary to adequately carry out one's own task. At the same time, however, the Jewish nurse's compulsion to justify himself reveals the immense pressure that weighs on the Jews of America. They have a reputation to lose as the population group that does not scream ojwage when it is attacked, that does not make a fuss, that on the contrary has to demonstrate normality at all times and pretend that Israel does not exist, which is why Mahler also speaks of his religion. No matter what happens, American Jews remain Americans. The old American anti-Semitism, which excluded Jews from participating in the activities of the upper classes until the 1950s and 1960s, they could not become members of golf clubs or take up leading positions in political parties, seemed to be over with the civil rights movement, whose core consisted of the alliance between Jews and blacks. The Jews fought in the movement in the second row and had to accept a kind of demi-status. The fact that anti-Semitism is now experiencing such a renaissance is attributed to political developments since Donald Trump's 2016 election campaign. Not without good reason, as the current president flirted with open anti-Semites, and in view of the Nazi march in Charlottesville in 2017, where people shouted, "The Jews won't replace us," the word anti-Semitism did not cross his lips. However, this alliance with the so-called alt-right is now history, and when it comes to Israel, Trump is more or less an advocate of realism and therefore a genuine perspective on peace. But one may wonder why it took the president so long to name the anti-Semitic nature of a mass murder in a synagogue. If commentators like Jeffrey Herf are to be believed, it is because America has no concept of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in America. This is supposed to be the hatred of Jews by white people, by guys like Bowers. Black and Muslim anti-Semitism have nothing to do with this. They're completely different. They result from immediate concern about Jewish exploitation and the arrogance of white Jews. This is also expressed in the election results of two Muslim Democratic anti-Semites in the midterm elections, who also owe their seats in the House of Representatives to numerous Jewish voters. Ever since James Baldwin, the Franz Fanon of the United States, issued his infamous statement Neo-Semitism on April 9, 1967. Since James Baldwin, the Franz Fanon of the United States, published his infamous statement Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white in the New York Times on April 9, 1967, in which he not only declared capitalism to be simply Jewish, but also anticipated that the relevant circles would complain about his comparison between Harlem and the Warsaw Ghetto. While he blamed colonization and Christianization since the Romans, and ended by claiming his Christian charity for the fact that he could not hate anyone. Since then, at the latest, it has not been possible to speak critically in America about anti-Semitism, racism, and about Islam, because the fact that Baldwin was defending the nation of Islam with his declaration was understood by everyone at the time. As a result, there can be no debate today about whether anti-Semitism, as it appears today, is actually good old American anti-Semitism. Doubts about this could arise simply in relation to the quantity of hate crimes classified as anti-Semitic in New York in recent years. Contrary to the prevailing assumption, according to police information, anti-Semitic incidents account for half of hate crimes in 2017. To put that number in perspective, there have been 4 times more crimes targeting Jews than blacks. Hate crimes against Jews outnumber those against trans people by a factor of 20. The New York Times reported just days after the Pittsburgh mass murder, and had to concede, if anti-Semitism is not perceived as a serious problem in New York, it is because there is no simple explanation and no clear ideological enemy. In the last 22 months, not a single person identified or arrested for an anti-Semitic hate crime has been linked to a far-right group. End quote. Today's anti-Semite, like Bowers, draws on a wide variety of sources to confirm his predetermined beliefs in the case of the Pittsburgh killer, It seems to have been about hatred of a powerful Jewish lobby that enables immigration and threatens the white race, but also simply about the influence of Jews on American politics. As contradictory as this may be, it corresponds to the mechanism of total projection. Everything, really everything, is attached to the Jew and identified in him, however blatant the contradictions inherent in this delusion may be. In this totality of projection, white anti-Semitism in the USA is nourished by black and Islamic hatred of Jews. In Bauer's subject, as in other white assassins of recent years, an unconscious identification with jihadism comes to the fore. Their actions are by no means based on the anti-Semitism of Henry Ford, who saw himself as the capitalist counterpart to the cosmopolitan communist Jews. Rather, the new American anti-Semitism sees itself, in line with its black or Islamic counterparts, as an opponent of the power identified as Jewish. Opposition to Islam is at most of marginal importance, which also applies to large sections of the European New Right. At the center is the phantasm of a general Jewish threat, which Bowers has attached to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Service, RIS, a refugee aid organization that has developed into an anti-racist mouthpiece against Trump's policies in recent years. Of course, one could ask why Jewish organizations of all people are committed to the immigration of Muslims, very few of whom are apostates or at least secular, and whether they're not contributing to subjugation in this way. But that was not Bauer's point, and that distinguishes him from the neoconservative or even far-right tendencies in and around the Trump U.S. administration. Bowers differs from the latter not only in his apocalyptic worldview, which also seems to have been cribbed from jihadism, but also in the eavesdropping on the noise and immediacy described by Dr. Cohen, with which Bowers has derived a call to action from what he has eavesdropped on. The words mean things is how Cohen describes Bowers' mode of perception, and it is this mode of perception that also describes the jihadist when he takes action. The symbolic equation can no longer distinguish between the thing named and the thing it names. Words mean things mean words, and the central distinction that constitutes the ability to think that the word is not identical to the thing and the idea is not identical to reality is regressively abolished. In this respect, the relief felt by left-wing and anti-racist circles that this time the murderer was not a Muslim is deceptive. They are, of course, not oblivious to the fact that the anti-Semitic motivation stems from the crisis and that its concrete implementation ultimately has nothing to do with ideology, but rather that it chooses the most suitable ideological option. The fact that the massacres of recent years, whether committed by jihadists or not, bear an Islamic signature, just like Anders Breivik's mass murder on the island of Utoya, and are necessarily anti-Semitic cannot be understood by anyone who does not place the ideology of the murderers in relation to their unconscious fantasies. The result is an equation between the new right and Islam, which can no longer distinguish which forms of social intercourse are longed for or abhorred. This equation is also symbolic in the sense that it is no longer possible or desirable to differentiate between the totalitarian ideology as a symptom and affirmation of crisis, which is embodied in the promise of a permanent state of emergency in Islam and demands complete individual subjugation. And this is related to the claim of National Socialism, and on the other hand, the authoritarian ideologies of crisis management, which still presume to have something like social or political creative power, and thus grant the individuals subject to them a certain degree of freedom to think and shape their own lives. However, this difference, which is self-evident in political theory, is only conveyed in its contradictory nature in the unconscious fantasy that structures the subject's perception. If the devotion to totalitarianism is determined by the fantasy of an omnipotent mother who transfers omnipotence to the subject without mediation and containment by the father, the authoritarian trait, in contrast, is ultimately determined by a limitation of omnipotence, which, in contrast to totalitarianism, is characterized by a need for structure and predetermination. The phallus is thus kept in the womb of the follower of the totalitarian, and the longing is for regression into the structureless. In the authoritarian, the phallus is outside the womb and symbolizes the power of the father and the law. To put it another way, on the one hand, it is about a concretistic penis without testicles, without the power to reproduce, which makes the power of the mother absolute and the penis its property. Thinking is hardly possible for a subject that is subject to this fantasy, because the inner psychic space that can distinguish between inside and outside, between fantasy and reality, between man and woman, etc., is not developed. Such a subject, even if it can conceive or have children, lacks the awareness of what happens when it comes to the act of procreation. Secondly, it is about an idea in which the phallus is the central external instance of creation, i.e. a penis with testicles as a conditio sine qua non. In this authoritarian fantasy, the phallus has absolute power. The ability to think is not prevented, but blocked because the fear of occupying the psychic space that does exist with one's own thinking is very great. The triangular inner space between mother, father, and self is occupied by constraints that restrict thinking, but do not make it impossible as such. In this sense, the authoritarian hatred of the Jews is a benign envy that does not want to take away from the Jews what they possess in terms of assumed benign paternal authority, which is conveyed in their law-abidingness, but rather wants to share in it. This hatred found its reaction in the enthusiasm of the Springer Press for the Six-Day War, for example. This form of anti-Semitism transcended its historical core of truth at the beginning of the 20th century in the simultaneous victory and defeat of the Dreyfusards. But like social democracy, which has become just as historical, it still finds followers because, even after Auschwitz, it points to the unfulfilled, especially on the right today. Ani Mahler, in his deep attachment to Judaism, will be understood or misunderstood as a left-wing critic of Trump, but his words could also be understood as generally as he formulated them and interpreted accordingly. Namely, that he has a very general process in mind that threatens to dissolve the rules of society and thus the paternal law and its goodness love towards all people. For the totalitarian hatred of the Jews knows only their death, because it cannot forgive the imputed betrayal of the mother. This envy wants destruction. It does not want to have what the Jews possess. It wants to kill all Jews. It is this destructive narcissism that unites the murderers of today. And instead of being relieved that this time it was not a jihadist who killed Jews, the Pittsburgh massacre should cause deep concern. A symptom of the fact that we have not yet come to terms with the course of those things that can be words and symbolic equation, and vice versa. Just a week before the anti-Semite and right-wing extremist Stephen Ballier attempted to enter the synagogue in Halle on October 9th with self-made weapons and a fantasy combat outfit with the intention of killing as many Jews as possible, where he suspected numerous visitors due to the holiday of Yom Kippur. An attempt had been made in Berlin to gain access to the new synagogue on Oranienburger Strasse with hostile intent. While Ballier shot a passerby outside the synagogue and the customer of a kebab shop after his attempt failed and injured two other people until he was arrested by patrol officers. In the Berlin case, the early intervention of security staff, who incapacitated the perpetrator with pepper spray, prevented more serious crimes. There is now a detailed Wikipedia entry on Ballier's assassination, but only brief newspaper reports on the Berlin attack, which policemen and journalists almost universally refer to as Vorfall. While Ballier's name is known to the entire population, the name of the Berlin perpetrator, the Syrian refugee Mohammed M., is known to almost nobody. Ballier, who has confessed to his crimes and has taken the opportunity to admit that he is critical of Jews, is being investigated by the federal prosecutor's office for 2 counts of murder and 9 counts of attempted murder. Mohammed M., who according to witnesses shouted Allahu Akbar and fuck Israel, while trying to climb over the fence of the new synagogue armed with a 20-centimeter hunting knife, is being investigated for trespassing. He was transferred to a psychiatric ward and released after inpatient treatment. His current whereabouts are unknown to the authorities. Mohammed M.'s crime could have been addressed directly at the place where it was committed. When German Chancellor Angela Merkel went to the new synagogue on Oranienburger Strasse on the day of Ballier's attack to express her condolences to the relatives of the victims of Halle, while the state secretary in the Berlin Senate Chancellery, Sasan Chebli, called for solidarity with the Jewish community, and Interior Senator Andreas Geisel, SPD, lamented the attack on our free society. Any one of them could have taken the opportunity to make the connection to the less momentous attack. The previous Friday, which was perceived as threatening not only by the Jewish community. However, it was left to Marcel Luth, FDP, to point out the coincidence of the two events, who objected to the trivialization of the Berlin crime as a petty offense. However, such oppositional interjections have long since ceased to irritate the practiced attitude towards Islamically motivated anti-Jewish attacks. If someone tries to enter a Jewish place of worship in defamation of Israel and equipped with an instrument of murder, in Germany it is certainly not a case of anti-Semitism, but of a psychological disorder, whenever it is a member of the Ummah who has been permanently insulted by the Jewish state. In the case of Mohammed M., this diagnosis also served to ward off any consideration of an anti-Jewish motive, while an Islamist background to his act, although he accompanied it with the Allahu Akbar call, was not seriously considered. In an interview with the Tagesspiegel, senior public prosecutor Dirk Feuerberg demonstrated how such trivialization works. The reference to Mohammed M.'s mental illness caused by trauma and his statement that he could not explain his own behavior was enough to rule out the possibility that the Syrian could be the justifiable subject of an attack motivated by hostility towards Jews. According to Feuerberg, there had been neither assaults nor threats of assault in Berlin. The fact that he does not classify the attempt to gain armed access to a synagogue accompanied by the battle cry of Islamism and anti-Israeli slogans as a threat of assault is explained by Feuerberg's definition of Islamism. According to Feuerberg, in view of the knife attack at the Paris police headquarters a few days ago, the Attorney General's office had considered that the Berlin attacker could have been sent as an assassin and controlled in some way, but there were no indications of this. The evaluation of Mohammed M.'s cell phone and computer data also offered no evidence of the man being controlled or radicalized, so far not even for a particularly strict interpretation of the Quran. Because control or dispatch cannot be proven, the knife that became a murder tool in Paris and elsewhere is transformed back into a somewhat brute household object at best, the procurement of which is not sufficient for the preparation of a serious act of violence endangering the state. Feuerberg seems never to have heard of the fact that the procurement of knives has long been recommended by IS precisely because of their dual function as a tool and weapon for the purpose of attacking infidels, but also that, conversely, no connection to IS and no knowledge of the Quran are necessary for the commission of Islamically motivated crimes. In any case, he only considers a Syrian refugee to be an Islamist if he has been indoctrinated, seduced, or otherwise remote controlled by Islamist groups. Islamic hatred of Jews qua self-direction, as an expression of self-chosen migrant identity, appears to be a contradiction in terms. In the case of Stefan Ballier, the relationship between external and self-direction was assessed differently. When it became clear in the course of the investigation that he had apparently planned and carried out the attack, which was initially assumed to have been carried out by one or more accomplices, single-handedly, a view immediately emerged that interpreted the individual perpetration as an expression of collective complicity, namely a silent consensus. In his letter of confession posted online, Ballier claims to have received financial support from a Jew named Mark, with whom he had been in contact on the internet, because he had expected Ballier to kill mainly Muslims. Despite its dubious nature, the allegation was immediately seized upon. The seemingly obscure aspects of self-direction and the self-help dilettantism that characterize Ballier's act prove that the individual act would not have happened without reference to an admittedly diffuse community, for which the perpetrator acted as a representative and to which he constantly addressed himself. He produced weapons with a 3D printer, announced his crime from October 1st in 3 confession letters posted online as PDFs, sent the course of the crime in real time to the streaming platform Twitch using a cell phone mounted on his helmet, and commented on each phase of the attack, partly in English and partly in German. This interpretation has just as many good reasons on its side as it follows a wrong intention. The good reasons lie in the fact that Ballier, like Anders Breivik or Brendan Tarrant, actually embodies a type of assassin in which the characteristics of the gunman and the terrorist are combined in that he is an isolated, even a socialized individual, following the role model of the lone wolf. And in this self-aggrandizement through Nazi, chauvinistic, and conspiracy theories. Chauvinistic and conspiracy theory forums on the internet hallucinate themselves and their actions as agents of an invisible but omnipresent community, a race marginalized and deprived of its privileges by enlightenment, secularism, and cosmopolitanism. In an interview with Der Spiegel, sociologist Matthias Quandt from the Institute for Democracy and Civil Society in Jena assigned Ballier to this type of perpetrator, which has been characteristic of white supremacy ideology in the USA since the 1990s. Quinn interprets the fact that Ballier addressed his potential audience before and during the crime partly in English as an indication of an international of human haters. The fact that Ballier's pre-announcement of his act on the Maguka image board was not taken seriously by users and that the live stream on Twitch, on which he broadcast his act, was apparently only watched by 5 people in real time, does not refute this interpretation. Rather, the community based on mutual cameo-radical self-exaltation, as created by male alliances, is replaced by media-mediated participation in a virtual collective in the case of the psychologically disengaged solitary person embodied in the lone wolf type. Complete asociality, the dissolution of personally and professionally mediated relationships with other people, turns into the self-dissolution of the isolated in a virtual, derealized community in a double sense. What is problematic about the perception of Ballier's assassination is not this interpretation, but its transformation in the service of Islam appeasement and the Volksgemeinschaft against the right. Instead of deciphering the necessity of media mediation of his act and the constant monologuing into the recording device that accompanied the act as indications that the community, of which Ballier apparently saw himself as a part and vanguard, had to be created first and foremost with the support of the media and autosuggestively. This virtual community is simply equated with the self-evidently right-wing populist public, with Ballier being declared the incarnation of an overall climate. Hostile to Jews, Islam, and women created not only by the AfD, but by all political forces not yet brought into line by civil society, basically by majority society as a whole. An example of this is an article by Alexander Nabert in the Taz newspaper, which made the following judgment the day after the attack under the headline Collective Lone Perpetrator. After the perpetrator Stephen Ballier was caught, the news came about the state of the investigation. It was a lone perpetrator after all. In the language of investigators, this initially only means that it is assumed that there was a single perpetrator. But even if he turns out to be the perpetrator without a corresponding environment, he was not alone. The term lone perpetrator always suggests exactly that: a single person who goes mad somewhere in his quiet little room, probably crazy, commits a cruel, single act independently of the rest of the world. That sounds so wonderfully relieving to our ears. It sounds as if we all had nothing to do with the murderer. Single perpetrator, that sounds like, there's nothing to see, please move on. For Nabert, whose commentary reads like an illustration of the psychoanalytical theory of the return of the repressed, the fact that the Halle attack was not committed by a Muslim, but by someone who biographically and socio-psychologically embodies precisely the type of perpetrator that trivializers of Islamic hatred of Jews virtually wish for as the main enemy of Jewish life in Germany, seems to be wonderfully exonerating. White male, post-GDR biography, child of divorce, dropped out of chemistry studies, withdrew application to the Bundeswehr as a regular soldier, and, according to general assessment, a non-social person. What Nabert says about the relativizing function of talking about the lone perpetrator, who is presumably crazy and committed the act independently of the rest of the world, did not apply to the Ballier case even at the time Nabert wrote his text. In this case, the media and political public immediately interpreted the act in unison as symptomatic, as an expression of general social conditions. And no one put forward a mental disorder as an excuse. On the contrary, there had been talk of such a disorder 5 days earlier in order to dismiss the Berlin assault committed by an actor of the wrong origin, which Nabert himself only acknowledged in a subordinate clause, as so minor that it could not even be described as an individual act. The sentence, "There is nothing to see, please move on," which Nabert imports into the Halle scenario, is the empirically correct description of the reaction to the event at the new synagogue. By meaning to talk about Halle, Nabert is actually talking about Berlin, as if in a waking dream. This reversal only nolens volens trivializes Ballier's concrete acts by presenting them as something for which we are all somehow responsible. While after Islamist attacks directed against Westerners of any origin, the formula is repeated as regularly as it is without reflection that such crimes are directed against us all, i.e. that they are not abetted or secretly endorsed by some of us. Above all, by transferring the denial phrases used after the Berlin attack to this case, the question is avoided as to whether the Muslim individual perpetrator, who has as few links to Islamic groups as Ballier, has to organize neo-Nazism, is not also acting in the name of a community that encompasses him and his peers. Only this question, however, opens up a view of the differences between the virtual community of incels, the sexually frustrated and fanatical involuntary celibates to whom Ballier was assigned, and the community of the for whose permanent lifelong addressing and visualization no live stream is required. The incel, the involuntary bachelor, is a man who is sexually as well as socially isolated, who blames the female sex in general and the emancipation of women in particular for the fact that no woman is available to him. People who know that 72 virgins are waiting for them in paradise do not have such problems, which could only arise in the course of generally enforced bourgeoisie. Although they seem to resemble the type of Islamic young man in the larmoyant self-victimization with which they derive the aggressive demand for immediate rule from their status as social perennial bulls, the incels differ considerably from the latter in their socio-psychological genesis, as well as in the nature of their potential for violence. The difference can be summed up in the fact that the incel community celebrates its online hero cults, accompanied by tearful abuse not only of emancipated women, precisely because its members secretly know that they will never be able to be martyrs or even heroes in real life, whereas the young Islamic man who fights against Jews, women, and homosexuals in individual battles never sees himself as a loser, but as a victim called to martyrdom and acts accordingly. The resistance of reality, which fortunately makes an increasingly obvious mockery of prepotent masculinity today and drives the incels to swap frustrating reality for a virtually mediated delusional world, which in turn is then taken for real, simply does not exist for the Islamically motivated type of perpetrator. The reason for this is not only the significantly different treatment of male children in European and Islamic societies, which means that the process that psychoanalysis defines as the internalization of the reality principle, and which is strictly demanded of male subjects in bourgeois society in particular, often cannot develop in the socialization of Muslim boys. It is probably at least as important that the welcome policy propaganda of tolerance and diversity virtually prevents such resistance to Islamic masculist claims to omnipotence from arising, at least in the host country. The no means no that young feminists hurl at even the most harmless Occidental knee-jerker always gives way to culturally sensitive rationalization in the case of assaultive young Islamic men. But precisely because, unlike the Western masculist, he has never felt the resistance of reality to his narrow-minded masculinity, the young Islamic man does not experience and reflect on himself as a loser. Donald Trump famously called the executors of Islamic virtue terror losers with the understandable intention of demythologizing them, but in fact incorrectly. However, it was Ballier, and not just any Islamic terrorist, who continuously referred to himself as a loser in the recorded commentary of his attack. He calls himself a loser after failing to gain entry to the synagogue. He calls himself a loser after accidentally shooting into a car tire. Towards the end of the live stream, he describes his act as an example of the uselessness of self-made weapons and sums up, "I'm a complete loser." Trump would probably be the first to sign that Ballier is a loser, just like the attackers in Paris, Brussels, Manchester, or Orlando. However, the similarity of the words belies the difference that the type of perpetrator embodied by Ballier accepts society's judgment of him with destructive outward frustration and does not want to refute it through his actions, but rather murderously confirm it. Whereas it is characteristic of the type of perpetrator socialized by Islam not to understand this judgment at all. By repeatedly calling himself a loser, Ballier talks about himself and to himself in the imagined and real presence of his peers in the same way that the political power symbolized in the person of Trump would talk about him, whose judgment he accepts in order to legitimize his lashing out. In Ballier, this blurs the traits of the gunman with those of the right-wing extremist. Proud victims, on the other hand, can never be losers because the concept of victim includes the creation of meaning. Where Muslim schoolyard racists insult effeminate classmates as victims, they are in fact insinuating that they are not proud victims, but simply losers. For the Islamic-motivated perpetrator, however, being a loser means no loss, which is why it does not frustrate him, but only confirms him in his judgment of the nullity and worthiness of destruction of civilization when its exponents insult him as a loser. The very idea that it is better to win than to lose contradicts in its instrumental calculation the logic of unleashed martyrdom that is inherent to Islamist terrorism as well as to Islam. If many of the Muslim migrants accused of sexual offenses, murders, and attacks on women, infidels, and the elderly since 2015 are strikingly similar in that they do not even regret their guilt for tactical reasons, but deny it by saying, for example, that the victim was only a woman. This does not simply express a lack of awareness of injustice, but almost the opposite. The self-confident awareness that the logic of right and wrong simply does not apply to them. Attempts to implement elements of Sharia law and civil law, as have been undertaken with increasing brazenness since 2015, encourage this attitude. It is further strengthened when Western societies refuse to take preventive action and use repressive measures to set sensitive, i.e., tangible limits, at least externally, to the omnipotent mania that is unchecked by internal psychological resistance. Civil society can be easily mobilized against incels at any time, precisely because nobody wants to have anything to do with losers who have no social or political power on their side. Without the exclusion from everyday contexts, the establishment of a virtual parallel world for the incels would not even be necessary. Islamically socialized young men, however, especially in the manifestation of the refugee, are included in the multicultural Volksgemeinschaft in the peace nation par excellence, even if they violate all gender codes. They are spared the unsuccessful and, in their failure, affirmed isolation that characterizes the incels, because the host country itself systematically prevents them from experiencing a beyond of the communal on their own bodies. The necessity of isolation, which is intrinsic to the concept of civilization, and as whose murderous product of division the incels act, has never been expected of the Islamically socialized perpetrator, an outside world that is independent of him, that asserts itself in resistance against him and with which he would have to deal, does not exist for him, at least not as long as it is not socially produced and, if necessary, politically defended against the objects of migration policy care. The misogynistic incels community has been at the center of feminists' attention as a manifestation of so-called hate crime online and a symptom of a gender political rollback, and not just since Balier's attack. In the Anglo-American world, the dangerousness of incels has been widely discussed since 2018 at the latest, when the 25-year-old driver on the rampage in Toronto, Alec Manassian, who killed 10 people and injured 15, described his act on the internet as part of an incel rebellion. He cited Elliot Rodger, who had murdered 6 people and injured 13 near the campus of the University of California in Santa Barbara 4 years earlier, as a role model. One of the targets of Rodger's rampage was the house of a sorority. He said his motive was that women had repeatedly denied him sex, and he therefore wanted to take revenge on the female sex. In a manifesto entitled My Twisted World, Rodger wrote, "I can't kill every single woman in the world. I'm just going to attack the girls who represent everything I hate about the female sex." End quote. He lamented his virginity at length, for which he blamed the women who refused. Quote, "I am 22 years old, and I am still a virgin. I haven't even kissed a girl yet. I've been through 2.5 years of college, more than that, and I'm still a virgin. It's been very agonizing. College is the time when everyone experiences these things like sex and pleasure. I had to spend those years in solitude. It's not fair. You girls were never emotionally attracted to me. I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I'm going to punish you all for it." End quote. Suffering from the perpetuation of adult virginity was also the original subject of the online support group Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project, which was started by a Canadian student in 1997 and was aimed at men and women. 3 years later, the founder left her own forum because it had turned into a hate forum for misogynistic men, where insults and abuse, including death threats, were exchanged. In response to the misogynistic repurposing of her forum, the founder opened the website Love, Not Anger in 2018, which continues to pursue the purpose of encouraging people with limited sexual experience to socialize, but reflects the gender hatred that can arise from frustrating everyday experiences. To this day, incels are primarily a phenomenon in English-speaking countries, where most of the attacks based on incel ideology have taken place. In their threatening style of communication, as well as in their paranoid fight against effeminates supposedly dominating the Western states. However, there are overlaps with the protagonists of the German men's and Father's rights movement, who perceive the legal and political equality of women as a dishonorable restriction of customary male rights. And in the area of custody rights, sometimes very successfully fight for the perpetuation of female dependence on men beyond the existence of a marital and familial bond. There are similarities between men's rights activists and incels both in their fixation on the internet as a communication medium and in their sociopathic isolation compensated for by fantasies of grandeur. At least in contemporary German feminism. However, incels are addressed in a way that suggests that it is less about the subject matter than about what can be concealed with its help. Two conspicuous features suggest this. Firstly, the incels community in this country is the exclusive research field of network feminist experts, who are not far removed from the Manichaean gender ideology of incels in terms of self-referential communication and annoying nerdiness, but also in their stroppy aggressiveness and the de facto sexist worldview, according to which linguistic and intellectual inadequacy are signs of female rage. On the other hand, their preoccupation with the subject tends to ignore the social milieu from which the incels originate, their close ties to the world of Anglo-American colleges. Instead, the focus is on the unconditional will to present the incel as the prototype of the frustrated white man, whose eliminatory violence overshadows the threat posed by the misogyny of practiced Islam. The articles by the notorious incel researcher Veronica Crocker are exemplary in their attempt to downplay the misogyny of Islamic men and the growing importance of women for contemporary anti-Zionism by invoking the incel threat. In her article for the Tagesspiegel about the Halle attack, Crocker only mentions Ballier's anti-Semitism at the beginning, when she quotes his confession that he was convinced that the Holocaust never took place. She then goes on to subsume anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and the ideology of the Great Exchange as expressions of one and the same male social character, based on Ballier's idea that the Jew is the cause of mass immigration, which Western countries have nothing to counter due to falling birth rates. In the idea of the Great Exchange, anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and racism flow into one. Jews are to blame for women turning to feminism and are responsible for transporting migrants to Europe. She lists Ballier, Breivik, Tarrant, the assassin of El Paso, who shot 22 people in a racially motivated attack in August of this year, and the anti-Semitic attack on the synagogue in Poway, California, as variants of this recurring pattern of perpetrators, before moving on to the gamification of terror, which elevates terrorism to a kind of competitive game. This is the hobby of the permanently offended man who feels threatened by anyone who is not like him, i.e. not of the same ethical descent, not male, not heterosexual. From this point at the latest, what Crocker himself had previously described is forgotten. For Ballier, Jews, Muslims, and women are precisely not enemy images of equal rank and therefore interchangeable, because he hallucinates the Jew as the cause of a decadence in the enforcement of which migrants and women only played the helper role. According to his own delusional protocol, feminism and mass migration are symptoms of a process whose originator is the Jew. For Ballier, the anti-feminism prevalent in the incels community is therefore at best a side effect of his hatred of Jews. The fact that Crocker ignores this testifies to the fact that she sees the anti-Semitic terror primarily as an opportunity to bring her only topic into play, the omnipresent anti-feminism of Western men. In an article written by Crocker for the magazine Is 3W on Fundamental Male Fantasies, it becomes even clearer that her aim is not to seriously analyze the genesis of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, racism, or even misogyny, but to mobilize civil society against a certain type of masculinity, of which the fact that it exists in Crocker's imagination is more important than its existence in reality. In this case, she is stabbing all emancipation efforts of women and men who have renounced Islam in the back by identifying and differentiating chauvinist and anti-feminist currents that have emerged in the West as a reaction to the legal, political, and economic equalization of women, and the degradation of women to animals or things at best in Islamic societies as two manifestations of one and the same crisis of male identity or male narcissism. Quote, "Masculinity is in crisis because women are shaking the pillars of patriarchy. Now we need to differentiate. In the West, women have already fought for their rights as citoyennes against fierce resistance from men, but in practice, conditions are still determined by patriarchal structures and patriarchal violence. In societies dominated by political Islam, the fight for women's rights must be much more fundamental. End quote. As is usually the case when differentiation is emphasized, a leveling out takes place. Just as the difference between the state of women's emancipation in the West and in Islam is only a gradual and not a qualitative one, because the house father in slippers and the Muslim gentleman raping second and third wives with impunity are practically equally agents of patriarchal structures. So in the West, as in Islam, women are never perpetrators themselves. The few female figures who are voyeuristically invoked by the media as agents of Islamism only disguise the fact that it is primarily men who are behind Islamist terror groups. The fact that women in the West also had to fight for their rights as citizens not only against resistance from men, but also from women like Crocker, for example, who consider perspicacity, judgment, and logical thinking to be masculine and therefore of little benefit to women, is completely ignored. What remains is a toxic masculinity without a history, which is somehow also spread by Islamists, but whose archetype is the man who is offended by his disempowerment in the process of bourgeois socialization, the product of which was, among other things, the women's movement, and who strikes back vengefully. By ignoring the difference between this type of man and the masterly behavior of Islamic men, the white, Western, socially depreciated anti-feminist remains as a substitute image that contemporary feminism, which is sensitive to Islam, can use to its advantage. But as little as women like Ilhan Omar, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Judith Butler, or Lori Penny, who embody an increasingly female-dominated anti-Zionism, are simply figures. The permanently offended prepotency of young Islamic men has nothing to do with offendedness. Psychogenetically, talk of the subject being offended refers to the subject's confrontation, necessary in the history of civilization, with the resistance of a reality that is independent of it, but nevertheless encompasses it. Firstly, by recognizing the boundaries between one's own body and the body of the mother, and then by internalizing the principle of reality as an instance that represents reality even beyond its concrete presence. The agent of this mediation process is the father, not as a biological fact, but as an instance of socialization in which the mediation between the subject and the outside world is learned qua self-chosen libidinal occupation of the object world, but also self-activated self-objectification. In this process, insofar as it succeeds, the subject experiences a necessarily mortifying restriction of early childhood fantasies of omnipotence by the objectivity outside and within itself. In this respect, the bourgeois family, as an agency of forgiveness whose demands Crocker apparently failed no less than the men's rights activists, represents the compulsion to self-limitation and mediation towards everyone, including the male subject. In this sense, it can indeed be said of the incels that they are acting out an offended masculinity in a refractory and aggressive manner. What they accuse the women of is precisely the universalistic moment that the Western women's movements turned against the reality of bourgeois society as their own standard. Namely, that in this reality, according to their own concept, which they do not live up to, no one, not even any empirical man, can act as master of the house. But if Mai understands the incels in this way, as terrorists of offended masculinity, it is almost impossible to understand the Islamic assassin and the assaultive Muslim young man as equally offended, since offending is precisely what this social character would have to be socially inflicted on behalf of his fellow human beings and himself in the first place. This social character sees itself challenged in its groundless pride by the mere existence of an outside world precisely because it has never been offended and has never had to mediate between desire and reality, inside and outside. If this difference is not recognized, the talk of offended masculinity, which often has the tendency of simple disparagement with regard to the incels, mutates into trivialization and exculpation in the case of the young Islamic man. Decisive for this difference is the non-experience of sexual virginity, which in the self-designation of affected women and men as involuntary celibates was still completely value-free at the beginning of the online self-help group that later became a forum for misogynists. Strikingly, this experiential content, which is denied in the anti-feminist propaganda of the incels community and turned against a female external enemy hallucinated as a de-individualized species, is virtually absent from the male critical hype surrounding the incels. Crocker, who chews over the subject in countless, almost identical lectures, articles, and interviews and holds a kind of freelance monopoly on incels, does not concede at any point that the lack of sexual experience described by Roger in his self-declaration is not simply a deficit to be remedied as smoothly as possible by those affected, but a developmental disorder that deeply affects the psychogenesis of the individual, whose gender and class-specific differences in significance for men and women would first have to be unfolded before it can be explained why the failure to deal with this experience leads to misogyny and even murder in a certain male social character. However, since contemporary feminism, for which gender dissolves into a discursive construction and sexuality into gender, is not interested in the drive history of male and female individuals, unlike the second women's movement, it simply sees the incels as threatening dudes in their masculine presumption, who should be called off by a feminism that has been pimped up into a civil society total mommy. In her contributions, Crocker almost obsessively uses the pseudo-terminology of adolescent schoolyard bullies instead of analytical terms. Accordingly, Crocker's explanations of the incel character are exhausted in the unfolding of the tautology that these are men, and indeed, this is also almost tautological for her. White, heterosexual, young men who are taught in the schools of patriarchal capitalism that they are worth more than girls because of their gender, who are obsessively preoccupied with the idea of not having sex, which they are supposedly entitled to, whose ideal woman is virginal, underage, and sexually submissive, and who believe that any woman who supposedly denies them sex, has sex with others, in short, is a woman to be punished by harassment, rape, or murder. While the media warned after Stephen Ballier's attack against trivializing him as a lone perpetrator, which in reality only happens regularly in the case of attacks by Muslim perpetrators, Crocker superimposes the figure of the incel with the social character of the young Islamic man, which she does not want to talk about, and thus also misses the type of perpetrator she believes she is analyzing. In contrast to Islamically socialized perpetrators, incels have been taught at school and at university with welcome sustainability, that they are not worth more than girls because of their gender, and that sex is not something that a man is entitled to by virtue of being a man, but an experience that at best, sooner or later results from a happy combination of socialization and spontaneity. It is precisely the fact that they have learned this lesson, but do not want to come to terms with it, that characterizes the psychodynamics of their actions. The Islamically socialized young man, on the other hand, whose characteristics Crocker builds into the figure of the incel, so that he can better conceal them, wants his ideal woman to be virginal, underage, and sexually submissive, because he has never had to experience the failure that is neither his own fault nor the fault of others, and against which the incel runs amok the more he denies it. While the incel's virginity mania arises from the pathogenic defense against the existence of sexual experience in women, who thus have an autonomy ahead of him that he cannot tolerate, the image of the virgins waiting en masse in paradise doubles a significant shortcoming of the male Islamic social character, whose main problem is generally not his own virginity, the experience of female sexual autonomy, which the incels invoke in the form of an ever-repeating hallucinated threat, would have to be done to Islamic men in the first place, in the form of an overall societal slight. While incels who take action act out their lack of happy experience with female sexuality on empirical women who shrink into representatives of a species, while they take revenge on the women for the sexually unavailable woman. It is far more significant for sexual assaults by Muslim perpetrators that they punish sexually available women for the fact that they are individual women and not the generic specimens they want women to be. The fact that many of the rapes and murders of women by Muslim refugees in recent years have been directed either against their partners or against Western women who had a sexual relationship with them, a fact that has been fearfully hushed up politically and in the media, must be seen in this light. Unlike the crimes of incels, such acts are not aimed at exorcising traces of female emancipation that have taken place, but in practice negate the very condition of its possibility. If instead of naming this danger, we talk about the psychopathology of young white men, who are old men at least insofar as they already rightly see themselves as devalued by the social process, we promote the triumph of a real but non-Western male domination in the imaginary fight against a supposedly Western patriarchy, which together with Wolfgang Schaubel More and more women who consider themselves politically enlightened apparently also see as an alternative to the impotent Occident. The other person was more cunning and unscrupulous than you despite being less competent, says the employee who was outperformed by a colleague in an internal job advertisement for a management position. I could have managed that too. And even better. Some people say about the plot of the movie after watching it, and the fans know much better than the entire coaching staff how they could have prevented their own club's home defeat anyway. Only when the offended colleague comes up with evidence of a plot against him by the successful player, a literature student who unsuccessfully submitted a play to a competition years ago, recognizes his ideas in a play that is now being successfully staged and declares them stolen. Or a soccer fan at the annual members meeting launches into a lecture about the connections he has discovered between the club's top management and human trafficking rings. Does the respective environment taken? Uncomfortable distance. What do you actually love about your husband? In response to this survey in a magazine, which Adorno examines in an early text from 1931, the wives questioned did not submit answers that would have been an expression of a specific inclination towards their loved one. Instead of, for example, talking about how the quirks of both partners developed into shared characteristics over the course of their time together, which differentiated themselves with the other's own, the women's answers were stereotypically similar, whereby, according to Adorno's observation, one motif runs through all the answers. One should not prematurely call it the tendency to childishness. You have to look closely at how it manifests itself. The first says, I like him because he often seems very childlike to me, a very naive little boy, because he needs me so much, because without me he would fall into every pit and be hit by every brick. Then I like him for all the little things, his passion for water, swimming, showering, splashing around. The next one has to do with the charming boy's forehead. I love his helplessness, the peace of mind with which he tries to disguise it. I also love the fact that he learns nothing and forgets nothing, and is just as small as in his first picture with the wooden horse. End quote. Adorno deciphers the supposed tendency towards childishness as infantile masculinity, which is the flip side of an authoritarian, latently sadistic character. But the formula that applies to everyone is the victor smile. A happy, proud, somewhat brutal smile. A smile that radiates the awareness of being master, of having brought the loving woman to complete compliance. The smile that, despite all the promises of equality, openly admits that he feels like the giver, the joy giver. That's what he looks like, the dear boy. Don't argue that it's motherly nature talking here. No one will deny her right, and no one will want to drive out of waking life all the childish dreams that alone are capable of moving it. But the form in which the adult legitimately takes childhood with him is only that of memory, not that of unaltered fixation. The image of a child in man that the lady's answers project, however, is in truth an image of the infantile. Infantile is the glorification of the body, which, thoroughly neutralized erotically, is limited to gargling and splashing around. Infantile, finally, is the neurotic mechanism of stupidity that indiscriminately endears to the other everything that is retarded, badly unconscious, mutely natural, be it because the enquête ladies themselves are designed in such a way that better things no longer fall within the scope of their inclination, be it because there is nothing else to love in their partners. That saucy boy with that winning smile, that is not the least bit brutal, but is ready to smash the toy into which their world has been transformed into in the next moment. End quote. A good 70 years later, Mohamed Merah's self-portrayed victor's smile haunts the media. In spring 2012, he kept France in suspense when he first shot 3 dark-skinned, uniformed members of the French army, and then murdered a religious teacher, his 2 young daughters, and the 10-year-old daughter of the deputy principal in a Jewish school within the space of just a few days. After being tracked down by the police, Merah barricaded himself in his Toulouse apartment for several hours and fought a gun battle with the police, during which he was shot dead. Merah used the time his apartment was under siege to proclaim himself a holy al-Qaeda warrior to the authorities. He cited the legal ban on veiling, the French mission in Afghanistan, and the killing of Palestinian children by the Israelis as the motive for his crimes. Merah's death prompted his wife Hiziyadi, who was only married under Islamic law, to share her loving feelings for the murderer with the public. I had never seen him before, and I didn't know his family either. We met frequently for 14 days, and I liked his manner. With the consent of our families, we decided to get married. After the ceremony, I really fell in love with him because he was so kind, sweet, and friendly. We watched The Simpsons together. He talked a lot and he needed to be listened to. He needed love, and I compared him to a baby. Our faith was there. We had lots of religious conversations, but the time we spent together, we played PlayStation or Call of Duty on the internet and Need for Speed. Nobody came to our house because Mohammed didn't want other men to see me. But he continued to meet up with his friends from the site at the time, who call themselves Muslims, but aren't really. End of quote. The statements of the loving German wives from the 1930s and Hizia, who converted to Islam comparatively late, are astonishingly similar, right down to the choice of words. They converge in the effective occupation of the image of a child and man, which is in truth an image of the infantile. The promise of equality within the bourgeois marriage, which was in principle even more open to Mohammed and Hizia as French citizens than to the married couple in Adorno's example, is followed here and there by the betrayal committed together. The man acts as the giver of joy. The woman does nothing better than devotedly receive the poisoned gift. The man's infantilism is articulated in his victorious smile, which is not the least bit brutal, but is ready to smash the toy into which her world has been transformed in the next moment. The love shown to the infantile chauvinism of the man allows the woman to effectively occupy her own inferior position and identify with it, while the erotic between the two is thoroughly neutralized. However, the possibility of deciding on a marriage in which both have their own independent life for themselves, but out of freedom take on the mutual responsibility for each other, was not only already given to the men and women of the 1930s, but to Mera and Hizia, who were both born and grew up in France precisely because Islam, whose rigid sexual morality is of course opposed to this freedom to be faithful, is only present in a rudimentary form in their families. Mera's father left his wife and children at an early age. His mother, who works as a cleaner to support the family, mockingly warned a family friend not to be surprised if he, Mohammed Mera, stops kissing his cheeks, the customary gesture of greeting in France, because he's now playing at being a believer. Although Islam by no means commanded his consciousness as a natural reality, Mera decided on his own free will in favor of a halal marriage, as he longed to be master, to bring the loving woman to complete compliance. Adorno. The Sharia-compliant marriage contract is the form, albeit not legal, but socially accepted, which within the framework of bourgeois law, which continues to abandon its universal claim, allows the covenant for life to be lived as an infantile symbiosis based on identification with one's own subjugation. The will to annihilation, which Adorno already sees announced in the image of a child and a man, and its inner kinship with the sadism of the victor in the private sphere, but whose empirical representatives at the time, in decisive contrast to Mera, have not yet taken action, thus returns in a modernized regression. The 18-year-old Hizia has also fallen in love with a man stuck in childhood and continues to rave about Mohammed, my husband, my baby who needed so much love, although on January 2nd of this year, after only 18 days of marriage, he dumped her in front of her parents' apartment without any explanation and pronounced a divorce, meaning that she experienced the brutality and cruel indifference of the infantile man in need of love firsthand. But while the intimate togetherness of the couple in Adorno's example, with gargling and splashing, still seems to know a sensuality, albeit largely reduced to bodily hygiene, Mera and Hizia's marital bliss took place in front of the screen, where they operated against or with each other in multiplayer mode as infantry soldiers in the theaters of war of the Second World War, or engaged in chases with the cops Allah, Bonnie, and Clyde. The mutilated remnants of despised sexuality in the mode of infantile regression were expressed in the wild pressing of the game console, in the bodily contortions towards the virtual enemy, and in the outbursts of whoops and curses. Staring at the screen for hours on end, they exorcise the experience of the presence of themselves as bodies in which they are stuck, from which they cannot escape, and in which they writhe as an appendix of the game console, completely isolated from one another and united only in their identification with the game, with which Mera presumably already rehearsed their destruction. Their entire marital happiness derives its impetus from handling the body, its limbs, as if they had already been severed. In Hizia's case, A vacation in Algeria was decisive for the need for self-determination. Back home in Toulouse, she decided to wear the jilbab. But the veil did not satisfy her recently discovered need. 2 months later, she also covered her face, although her mother and older sister did not even wear a headscarf. She had wanted her husband to wrap himself in plutterhosen and let his beard grow, but Mara refused on the grounds that she didn't want to attract attention. However, it would be short-sighted to assume that a sleeper was at work here who chose inconspicuousness for tactical reasons. A psychological report on Mara, written in January 2009 after a failed suicide attempt, emphasizes his essential narcissism. The patient, who is certified as fully sane, constantly talks about his appearance, which he attaches great importance to, about new clothes and brands that interest him, but all this without any intention to seduce. Mara's chic clothes, his enthusiasm for flashy watches, the latest iPhone model, and fast cars are products of Western society, whose vulgar consumer orientation he has internalized and which he despises beyond that. The erotic promise of happiness offered by Western accessories, the power of attraction they could possibly provide, is out of the question for him. But as a means of erasing the last traces of eroticism in women and in himself, his fetishism of cleanliness and brands can be reconciled with Islamic patriarchal sexual hostility. It is not only the desexualized, autistic pursuits that literally kill time that are modern, but also the awareness of potential superfluousness that manifests itself in them. But where in the Western world there is at least still the possibility, through effort and education, of using the time that passes until death for something other than one's own stagnation. The young of the subsequent generations of immigrants give in to their loudly expressed frustration and voluntarily lead an undead life in the banlieues, in which every day is like the next. According to Jungle World's France expert Bernhard Schmid, the feeling of frustration, itself a regressive, infantile emotion preserved by adults, is said to have been Mohammed Merah's understandable motive for killing 7 people. On March 29th, he pontificated in the weekly newspaper Psychology Hoot as follows. According to the intelligence services, Merah failed in his attempt to be taken in by the Taliban or other jihadist groups and trained in a camp. Merah's life in France was not exactly successful either. Rather, it was characterized by further experiences of failure. These included 2 prison sentences, being admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and being discharged from the French army. Apparently, Merah radicalized largely on his own, without belonging to an organization. End quote. That is why he, without prospects and left alone by the French state, is a jihadist out of frustration. In the meantime, however, the accusation against the French state of having abandoned the banlieues, which became loud in the wake of the 2005 riots and was certainly justified at the time, has lost much of its plausibility. Since then, 600 million euros have been invested in the greater Paris area alone, not least as part of social initiatives, while much poorer towns in the north, such as Denain or Boulogne-sur-Mer, where the proportion of migrants is negligible, receive proportionally much less. But whatever happens, the Republic is always to blame. The unabated progressive Islamization of the young can be nothing other than the result of the malaise social, which has turned Mohammed Merah's life into a series of experiences of failure. This argument, according to which anti-Semitic murders are the short-circuiting actions of a big child raging out of anger and disappointment, is hardly any different from the attitude of the loved ones, who still love the bad boy even when his infantile play turns into practical destruction. With socio-pedagogical impetus, the adult murderer is exculpated as the underage child that he remained even as a man. However, the permanent feeling of being disgusted is by no means something apolitical, but rather the expression of a psychological disposition that tends towards anti-Semitism. In the paltry pastime of manslaughter, the stubborn life one is sent into is confirmed. It is no different with the suburban French kids who have come of age, who hang out on the street with their mates in never-ending puberty and no longer have the experience of moving from school and training to working life, possibly failing in the process, but perhaps also seizing their opportunities, poor as they may be. Even in 2005, the call for a better infrastructure in the banlieues was not voiced by the youngsters themselves, who rather beat them to a pulp in an expression of their frustration, because they see any possibility, however abstract, of changing their own lives as nothing more than an imposition. in settling into a dull life, in their adolescent need to belong to a clique. The migrant youth gangs in the western suburbs resemble the members of the male clans in the Arab world, who are constantly passing the balls of their prayer beads back and forth, and from whom the only difference is their gangsta outfits. The frustration that stylizes itself into a political effect is therefore not a legitimate feeling that protests against injustices that should finally be abolished, but the seed of a madness hardened against itself and against the world. Identical to the paranoia of those who believe they are constantly being taken advantage of from all sides, frustration as a political effect is already urging destruction of its own accord and meets with somnambulistic certainty with the contemporary manifestation of anti-Semitism, which today is Islam. The explanation that Mohammed Merah is a jihadist out of frustration therefore explains nothing, but is itself a tautology, because the self-confidently frustrated person who confuses his anger at the world with the truth already tends towards jihadism due to his psychological disposition. The hardening against any possibility of experiencing one's own life as changeable is also reflected in Merah's biography, which knows no development precisely because he was not a victim of circumstances, but actively and aggressively turned himself into one. Merah failed at school. He supplemented his welfare payments with petty crime. In the evenings, he went to discos. Occasionally, he looked at the Quran. While watching The Simpsons, he cringed with laughter and came into his own by identifying with Homer Simpson, admittedly conceived as a joke character, who poses as a patriarch but resembles his son Bart in his total incompetence. The neighborhood children admired the big guy because he played soccer with them and gave them sweets. In the stagnation of infantile masculinity, crudeness and sentimentality merge indistinguishably. What was perceived as isolated and disconnected in the statements of those who knew Merah and summarized in the newspaper cliché of the two faces of Mohammed Merah thus belongs together. While his lawyer Christian Edelin, who has defended Merah since he was 15 years old for crimes typical of these neighborhoods such as theft, assault, and petty crimes, and neighbors assure that Merah was gentle as a lamb. Another neighbor reports that Merah took her 15-year-old son home in his car in June 2010, where he showed him hours of Al-Qaeda videos in which women and men are executed in the most gruesome way. When the distraught boy confided in his older sister and his mother, the latter confronted Merah, whereupon he beat her up until she was hospitalized. Even after being charged with assault, Merah would not rest. Shortly afterwards, he stood under the window of the victim's apartment in a military camouflage suit and armed with a saber and shouted, "Allahu Akbar." Just when the infantile man, who perceives the whole world as an extension of himself, starts to play, his mania for destruction is unleashed, and when he practices it, he is still playing. As if for a children's carnival, Merah disguised himself as a mujahideen when he issued his death threats. He also acted like a megalomaniac player with the whole world at his disposal during his assassinations, which claimed the lives of 3 children. He used a chest camera to record how he executed his victims by shooting them in the head on the street in broad daylight. At home, he edited the scenes together, set them to music and Quran verses, and sent them to Al Jazeera and various brothers who were supposed to distribute the video on the internet. But Merah's infantile mania for destruction is not just the cruel game of an isolated loner who hallucinates brothers all over the world. Merah's virtual teammates are popping up all over the world. Le Figaro reported on April 26th on a video posted on YouTube, showing a ceremony taking place in the Maghreb in honor of the lion. Merah, which was led by the Tunisian Ali Belhaj, who founded the radical Islamic Front Islamique du Salat, FIS, with Abbasi Madani. The homage to Merah culminated in an invitation to those present to say good things about him, whereupon one participant with 2 nationalities burned his French passport, incited against the enemies of Islam, and defamed the president of the French Republic as a Jew and a pig. Al Jazeera, meanwhile, took a liking to Merah's own video and considered broadcasting it. Only after strong objections from Nicolas Sarkozy and the relatives of the victims did the head of the Paris headquarters, Ziad Tarouche, decide against it. Merah also mobilized his brothers in France, who admittedly do not form themselves according to the model of the Ummah, but in line with the times, but just as regressively, in the social networks. Just a few hours after Merah was shot by a special unit of the French Federal Police on March 22nd, new pages dedicated to paying homage to Mera appeared on the internet every hour. Especially on Facebook, where a number of fake profiles were created in the name of the murderer. Male and female Meras flocked together to pay homage to their brother and indulge their anti-Republican resentment in stunted SMS language and by clicking the like button. The comments posted on Facebook such as pigs, one against all, and he fucks them all? Well done, my brother, accompanied by a heart-shaped smiley button, continued on the streets, where graffiti such as the slogan Tragic Bar Mitzvah in Toulouse for Dead appeared, particularly in the banlieues, but also in the center of Paris. Facebook had to block all Mera pages following an intervention by French Interior Minister Claude Guet. In Mera's hometown of Toulouse, the police broke up a demonstration in his memory, in which around 30 people, mainly young veiled women, took part, while Arab men made a pilgrimage to Mera's apartment complex to take pictures of themselves with their cell phones in a Terminator pose. Statistics published by the Central Council of French Jews, CRIF, at the beginning of June show that Mera can indeed count on his brothers. In the month following Mera's killing alone, it counted 140 anti-Semitic attacks, which corresponds to a third of all recorded anti-Semitic attacks in the entire previous year. In view of this increase, Richard Praskier, chairman of the CRIF, concludes, "It's as if Mohammed Mera has become a role model, an example to follow." End quote. Bernhard Schmid doesn't want to have noticed any of this either. In Jungle World, he claimed that there was no danger of him, Mohammed Mera, becoming a figure of identification for young French Muslims. Meanwhile, the FAZ already reported in detail on the tributes to a terrorist on March 26th. But, after all, avowed leftists don't read the bourgeois press. The fact that Mera did not wear a beard, that he was rarely seen in the mosque, preferred to play computer games at home rather than pray, and apparently did not belong to any jihadist organization, i.e. that he was operating without a direct order when committing the murders, therefore does not speak for a crazy lone perpetrator who should not really be described as an Islamist. According to the unanimous tenor after Mera was identified as the perpetrator. The thesis of the lone perpetrator is based on the idea that an Islamist must always be a devout Muslim who at some point slipped into the radical camp, whereas a lout from the site, which Mera undoubtedly was, could not be described as an Islamist simply because of his adolescent gangsta behavior. Similarly, Yusuf Fofana, the leader of the 20-strong gang de Barbers that tortured 23-year-old Ilan Halimi to death for 3 weeks in January 2006, had already been trivialized by the media as a lone offender. However, Mera is neither a lone perpetrator who accidentally and unjustifiably invokes Islam in his atrocities, nor a devout Muslim who declares war on the infidels. The fact that Mera was able to drink beer and 2 minutes later ran off to pray must be taken seriously. This was not a case of a religiously convinced offender who, according to religious commandments, should not touch alcohol. Mera is jumping up from his glass of beer when he remembers that he still has to pray rather reveals that he has simply forgotten to pray, that his faith is by no means firmly anchored in his consciousness, just like his wife Hizia, who only reaches for the niqab as an adult woman and has the imam of the neighborhood find her a suitable husband, even though she was never forced by her family to wear a headscarf, let alone to marry in accordance with Sharia law. This arbitrary and inauthentic moment of faith could be specified with Adorno as unbelieved faith, just as the anti-Semite only believes by forgetting his faith. The instrumental and reified relationship to religion reflects the fact that Mera and Hizia did not grow up in some village in the Arab world, where from childhood onwards they experienced nothing other than the stunted life under the Oriental patriarchy, but in the French metropolis, where Islam is not, as it were, naturally and culturally anchored and only fragmentarily present in the families. It is newly learned and therefore all the more terrorizing, as a subsequent decision with which identification is all the stronger as the new believer always fears falling away from his faith. Faith is therefore not instrumental in the sense that Mera merely made use of Islam, but rather it is precisely the reified moment of faith, which was the result of a free choice and is therefore affirmed all the more brutally as a substitute for identity, which in itself urges murderous practice. With the murders, Mera did not simply execute his faith. Rather, they were an act of self-conversion. Mera's last pronouncements are not characterized by any genuine Islamic dogmatism, but rather, as a reconciliation of Islam and postmodernism, consist of a mishmash of set pieces from the Islamic partisan struggle, tirades of hatred against the French Republic, and phrase-like references to action heroes Allah Terminator. I haven't killed enough. I'm Allah's messenger. I fought for Allah. I've decided to bring France to its knees. I've got a 9mm, an Uzi, and a 45. You love life, I love death. End quote. His jihadist slogans and macho bluster seem like parroted phrases. At the same time, however, they're completely authentic because Mera took them seriously. In the end, he did not turn the gun on himself like a gunman running amok, but died in a hail of police bullets. Even if, in Mera's case, Islam is not the immediate basis of his actions, but rather empty and hollowed out, it is not interchangeable. The natural brotherhood directed against the abstract principle of citizenship, as found in the Islamic form of socialization of clan and tribal association, serves as an identitary counterprinciple to the Republican fraternité, whose universalism cuts the natural bond. This is probably the main reason why Mera allegedly targeted Muslim soldiers of African descent in the French army, whom he accused of treason rather than apostasy because of their deployment in Afghanistan. After all, the army in the bourgeois state, at least according to its own claim, is not simply a male association organized according to the principle of autochthonous brotherhood, but follows a state mandate. In this respect, it is not at all surprising that the French army has successfully recruited many young men from the first and second generations of immigrants in recent years who believe that the principle of Republican fraternity was a way out of the Islamic community. Mera had also applied to the army twice, but was rejected because of his criminal record. By killing the traitors, he brought them back into the realm of the Islamic Brotherhood. Mera also killed his other victims, the religious teacher and the 3 children from the Jewish private school in Toulouse, not because he thought they were hardened infidels, but according to his own explanation, because he wanted to take revenge on them for the deaths of Palestinian children. A thoroughly moral intention in keeping with the times, as evidenced by the Israeli reaction to Mera's murders by the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Catherine Ashton, who admittedly formulated her resentment against the Jews very subtly, as befits a politician, as Henrik M. Broder aptly remarked. Ashton said, "When we think of what happened in Toulouse, we remember what happened in Norway last year. We know what's happening in Syria at the moment, and we see what's happening in Gaza and other places. We think of young people and children who have lost their lives." End quote. One reason Mera may not have been aware of for his choice of victims is that Jewish schools, similar to Catholic schools, by the way, in France are now among the last enclaves of republicanism, which is in a state of decay. During the French Revolution, initial plans were already being projected for a centralized school system that would teach basic skills such as reading and writing so that the heirs of the Enlightenment could exercise their republican rights and perform their duties without the help of a third party. Although the educational ideal of the bons citoyens only became practical to a certain extent in the Third Republic, the École Républicaine fulfilled its role as a mediator of the principles of the Republic for almost the entire 20th century. These were always at least formally present in the classroom. Lessons were secular. Religion was relegated to the private sphere. Basic education was to be free, not a privilege of the better off, and equally accessible and compulsory for boys and girls. In this equality of all pupils before the authority of the school, boys and girls were comrades in the sense of the principle of fraternity. Today, this Republican class association has almost disappeared, especially in the suburbs, which are mainly inhabited by Muslim families. French and Jewish pupils, but also those who want to learn and achieve good grades, leave Islam at home, or are possibly not interested in it, are terrorized by the boys' cliques until they give up and join them or are transferred to private schools by their parents. Where Muslim youth gangs have taken command of the classroom, the Republican promise of the fraternité has given way to the principle of the identitarian horde of brothers. Mera, too, has not learned to form simple sentences correctly in his entire school career, which has been subtly described in the press as difficult. The document issued after the murders as a letter of confession from al-Qaeda was not written in Arabic as usual, but in French, which was riddled with mistakes. The fact that Mera targeted a private Jewish school after the murders of the military personnel can also be understood in this sense. By murdering where the class association was still intact, because French Jews in particular take the Republican values very seriously, which ultimately allow them to be French citizens and practice their religion at the same time, he carried the fight against the Republican class association into the seclusion of private schools. In doing so, he signified to the Jews that even these shielded Republican enclaves were no longer safe from the Muslim gangs of boys. Mera thus acted as their virtual gang leader and transported himself back to his own messed up and failed school days, making the infantile moment of his ideal of brotherhood very immediate and practical. The contemporary character of Mera is Megalomania, who acted in the Republican schools on behalf of the anti-Republican student horde in the banlieues, was revealed just one day after the murders of the Jewish children and their teachers. On March 20th at 11 o'clock in the morning, when Mera had not yet been identified as the perpetrator, Nicolas Sarkozy ordered a minute's silence in memory of his Jewish classmates, which was mandatory for all educational institutions in France. While the election campaign was suspended in view of the cold-bloodedness of the perpetrator, who grabbed a little girl by the hair so that he could shoot her in the head, the Islamic gangs in the schools took the opportunity for another infamy. Not only did many teachers refrain from holding the minute's silence from the outset for fear of the students' behavior, where they were held, the majority of pupils refused to participate in the ritual of remembrance with anti-Semitic slogans such as "I won't stand up for Jews," and "We don't give a shit, it was a Jew." Others made quite pluralistic suggestions to their teachers, which Catherine Ashton should have liked, such as "Why don't we have a 2-minute silence? One for the Jewish children and the other for the Palestinian children who die every day." Or "All over the world, children are dying everywhere. Let's have a minute's silence for them." The reactions ranged from malicious laughter and grins during the minute's silence to loud shouting in the classroom. A secondary school teacher in Rouen, who wanted to commemorate Mera herself for a minute after his identification, also made it clear that teachers can no longer be naively expected to fulfill their duties as civil servants. However, precisely because it is a symbolic gesture, the state-ordered commemoration is also a civilizing one. One articulates one's respect for the murdered, regardless of whether one is individually really shocked, affected, or not. Abstracted in this way, the ritual takes place as an act of substitution in the full sense, renouncing revenge and replacing it with justice. In contrast, the authentic commemoration of their hero, or of the Palestinian children proposed and sometimes practiced by Mera's admirers, compels each individual to be loyally affected, and is thus already a barely concealed call to take revenge and suspend the law. Even in the case of Mera himself, who took this call seriously and expressed to the police officers a need to see, touch, and film the victims, the mediation articulated in the symbolic gestures that are often so easily despised as dishonest and inauthentic is wiped away and replaced by a supposed authenticity that is brought to its consequent end in the identitarian desire for annihilation. In the contempt of the ritualized gesture of state commemoration, which is to be replaced by the effective immediacy of revenge, Islam comes to itself in the fusion of regression and hostility to tradition at the height of the times.